Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the most absurd, hilarious, and sometimes terrifying laws that humans have ever created. Imagine living in a world where stealing a cabbage could get you executed, where being late to pay your taxes meant death, where literally every single crime, big or small, carried the exact same punishment: your life. This was not fiction. This was Athens, Greece, in the year 621 before Christ. And the man who created this nightmare, his name was Draco. By the time we finish tonight, you will understand why his legacy still haunts our language today. So before we dive deep into this story, I need your help to keep this channel going. If you are enjoying what you are hearing right now, would you mind giving this video a like? And if you are new here, consider subscribing because we have 11 more incredible stories coming your way. Also, I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed on a night drive or maybe doing dishes? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, let us dim those lights, get comfortable, and step back 2,600 years into ancient Athens. Picture this: Athens in 621. Before Christ was not the philosophical paradise we often imagine. This was before Socrates, before Plato, before the golden age of democracy. This was a city in chaos. For generations, laws in Athens were not written down anywhere. They lived only in the memories of aristocrats, the wealthy, powerful families who basically made up the rules as they went along. If you were poor and got into trouble, you would stand before these nobles who would decide your fate based on, well, whatever they felt like that day. And here is the thing about unwritten laws: they're incredibly convenient for people in power. Imagine getting arrested today and the police officer says, "Well, I think this is illegal, so off you go to prison." No trial, no lawyer, no written law to reference, just the word of someone more powerful than you. That is what life was like for ordinary Athenians. They had no idea what was legal and what was not until it was too late. The poor people of Athens were fed up. They were tired of being arrested for crimes they did not know existed. They were exhausted by the arbitrary punishments handed down by aristocrats who seemed to have a different set of rules for themselves. The city was on the brink of revolution. Something had to change. And so the Athenian government decided to do something radical. They would create Athens' first written legal code. They needed someone to write it all down, to make the law clear and consistent for everyone. And they chose a man named Draco. Now, we do not know much about Draco as a person. History has not given us his life story, his personality, or even what he looked like. But we do know what he created. And honestly, what he created was so extreme, so unbelievably harsh, that his name literally became synonymous with cruelty. Here is what Draco decided. He looked at all the crimes that could possibly be committed in Athens: murder, assault, theft, tax evasion, public urination, picking someone else's vegetables, being lazy. And then he made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He decided that every single one of these crimes deserved the exact same punishment: death. Yes, you heard that right. Death for everything. Steal a loaf of bread because your family is starving? Death. Forget to pay your taxes on time? Death. Pick a cabbage from your neighbor's garden? Death. Get into a fist fight at the market? Death. Murder someone? Also death, but you know, at least that one makes some sense. Let me put this in perspective for you. Imagine if in modern America the penalty for a parking ticket was the same as the penalty for murder. That is essentially what Draco created. A legal system with no proportionality, no mercy, no second chances, just death, death, and more death. Now you might be wondering why. Why would anyone create such an insane system? And here is where it gets interesting, because Draco actually had a twisted logic behind his madness. According to later Greek writers, Draco believed that even small crimes deserved death because they showed disrespect for the social order. And if small crimes deserved death, well, he could not think of anything worse than death to give to big crimes. So everyone got death. There is actually a famous story about this. Centuries later, a man asked Draco why he made all his punishments death. And according to the ancient historian Plutarch, Draco supposedly replied, "Small crimes deserve death, and I can find no heavier punishment for great ones." That is not exactly a ringing endorsement for creative thinking in the justice system, but here is what I find fascinating. Draco was not actually trying to be cruel for cruelty's sake. In his mind, he was being fair. Remember, before his code, the aristocrats were handing out punishments however they wanted. Rich people got off easy, poor people suffered. Draco thought, well, if everyone gets the same punishment regardless of their crime, at least that is equal, right? He confused equality with justice. He thought that treating everyone the same meant treating everyone fairly. But as we know now, true justice requires nuance, context, and proportionality. Think about it this way. Two people come before Draco's court. One person stole medicine to save their dying child. Another person murdered someone in cold blood for their money. In our system, we would recognize that these are wildly different situations with different motivations and different moral weights. But under Draco's system, same punishment. Both would be executed. And here is the tragic part. The Athenian people actually did this at first. Why? Because at least now the law was written down. At least now they knew what would happen if they broke a rule. It was horrifically harsh, but it was predictable. And for people who have been living under arbitrary aristocratic whims for generations, even predictable cruelty felt like an improvement. But predictably, this system did not last long. The problem with making every crime punishable by death is that people start to realize the law makes no sense. Imagine being a jury member in ancient Athens. Your neighbor is on trial for stealing a chicken. You know this neighbor. He is a good man who fell on hard times. His kids were hungry, and now you are supposed to vote for his execution? For a chicken? The system started falling apart almost immediately. People refused to report small crimes because they did not want their neighbors executed over trivial matters. Juries started refusing to convict people for minor offenses because the punishment was absurdly disproportionate. The whole thing became unworkable, and so 30 years later, in 594 before Christ, Athens brought in a new lawmaker named Solon. And Solon, thank goodness, had more sense. He immediately repealed almost all of Draco's laws. He kept only one, the law about murder. Everything else was thrown out and replaced with a proportional system where punishments actually fit the crimes. But even though Draco's laws only lasted 3 decades, his impact on human language has lasted more than 2,500 years. When we call a rule or punishment draconian today, we are literally invoking his name. We are saying this is as harsh and unreasonable as Draco's ancient code. It is remarkable when you think about it. Most ancient Greek legislators are forgotten, but Draco's name lives on because his laws were so spectacularly terrible that they became legendary. Here is what strikes me most about this story. Draco thought he was solving a problem. Athens had chaos, arbitrary justice, and inequality. His solution was to create absolute equality through absolute harshness. But he learned, or rather Athens learned after him, that equality without wisdom is not justice. That treating everyone the same is not the same as treating everyone fairly. That sometimes the most important word in law is not equal, but appropriate. And honestly, we still struggle with this today. How do we balance equality with context? How do we create laws that are fair to everyone while still accounting for individual circumstances? These are not easy questions. Draco thought he had found the easy answer. One size fits all, and that size is death. But as Athens discovered, the easy answer is often the wrong answer. I also find it darkly funny that Draco's legacy is a cautionary tale. He wanted to be remembered as the man who brought order to Athens. Instead, he is remembered as the man whose laws were so ridiculous that his name became an insult. That is not the legacy anyone wants. So what can we learn from Draco's disaster? First, that laws without proportionality are not really laws. They're just tyranny with paperwork. Second, that equality and justice are not the same thing. And third, that sometimes the worst laws come from the best intentions. Draco genuinely thought he was helping Athens. He was not twirling a moustache and cackling while writing death sentences. He thought he was creating fairness. But good intentions without wisdom can create systems just as cruel as malicious ones. As we close this first chapter of our journey through history's strangest laws, I want you to think about this. What modern laws might future generations look back on and think were as absurd as Draco's code? What are we doing right now that we think makes sense but might be seen as draconian by our great-great-grandchildren? But we are just getting started. Because if you think ancient Athens had a monopoly on bizarre laws, wait until you hear what the Romans were up to. In our next part, we are heading to the Roman Empire, where the colour of your clothes could literally get you killed, where fashion became a matter of life and death, and where the government decided that your beard, or lack thereof, was a matter of public policy. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when the most powerful empire in history decides to play fashion police. The stories get even stranger from here. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where fashion was not just about looking good, it was about staying alive. If you thought modern dress codes were strict, just wait until you hear what the Romans were willing to do to control what people wore. We are talking about a civilization that created laws so specific they would tell you not just what you could wear, but what colour, what fabric, and even what your face should look like. And the penalties for breaking these fashion rules? Well, let us just say the Romans did not mess around. So here is a question for you. Have you ever been stopped from entering a restaurant or a club because of what you were wearing? Maybe you showed up in sneakers when they required dress shoes, or wore jeans when they wanted formal attire. Annoying, right? Now multiply that annoyance by about 1,000 and add the threat of execution, and you will start to understand what fashion meant in ancient Rome. Let us start with the most dramatic example, the colour purple. Today, purple is just another colour. Maybe it is your favourite, maybe you hate it, but either way, wearing it will not get you in trouble. But in ancient Rome, purple was not just a colour, it was a statement of absolute power. And if you wore it without permission, you could be sentenced to death. Now, you might be wondering why purple of all colours was so special. The answer comes down to economics and chemistry. The purple dye used by Romans was called Tyrian purple, and it came from a very specific place, inside tiny sea snails found along the coast of Phoenicia, in what is now modern-day Lebanon. And here is where it gets wild. To produce enough dye for just one toga, that is one piece of clothing, Roman dye makers had to harvest and crush approximately 10,000 of these mollusks. Think about that for a second. 10,000 sea snails for one outfit. The process was incredibly labour-intensive. Workers would collect these snails, crack them open, and extract a tiny gland that produced the dye. Then they would crush these glands and ferment them for days in huge vats. The smell was apparently so horrendous that dye workshops had to be located far outside city limits because the stench would literally drive people away. One Roman writer described the smell as offensive and persistent, which is ancient speak for absolutely disgusting. But the result of all this work was a colour unlike anything else in the ancient world. A deep, rich purple that would not fade in sunlight and actually became more vibrant over time. It was gorgeous, and because it was so expensive to produce, it became a symbol of ultimate wealth and power. By some estimates, a pound of Tyrian purple dye cost more than its weight in gold. Literally, you could trade gold for purple dye and come out even. So the Roman emperors, being the practical dictators they were, decided that if purple was the most expensive and beautiful colour, then only they should be allowed to wear it. And thus, the purple laws were born. Starting with the reign of Emperor Nero in the 1st century and continuing through subsequent emperors, it became illegal for anyone except the emperor to wear garments dyed with Tyrian purple. Not even senators, not even the emperor's own family members in some cases, just the emperor himself. Imagine being a wealthy Roman merchant. You have worked your entire life, built a successful business, accumulated a fortune that most people could only dream of. You have a beautiful villa, slaves to attend to your every need, respect in your community, and you think to yourself, you know what? I can afford a purple toga. I am going to buy one. So you do. You pay an astronomical sum for this gorgeous purple garment. You put it on feeling like $1,000,000. And then you step outside and the emperor's guards arrest you, because that colour on your body is considered an act of treason against the state. That is not an exaggeration. Wearing the wrong colour could be prosecuted as treason. And it was not just purple. The Romans had an entire category of laws called sumptuary laws, from the Latin word for expense, that controlled what people could wear, eat and display based on their social class. These laws were obsessively detailed. They specified that only Roman citizens could wear togas. Foreigners and slaves were forbidden from wearing them, even if they could afford one. The toga itself had variations that indicated your status. A pure white toga meant you were running for political office. A toga with a purple stripe, just a stripe mind you, meant you were a senator or magistrate. A dark-coloured toga meant you were in mourning. Women had their own set of restrictions. During certain periods, laws limited how much gold jewellery women could own. Some laws even restricted how women could travel, forbidding them from riding in chariots within city limits unless they were going to a religious ceremony. The government was essentially saying, "We will decide how much luxury you are allowed to display, thank you very much." But here is where it gets even more bizarre. Emperor Augustus, who ruled from 27 before Christ until 14 in the Common Era, decided that fashion laws were not enough. He wanted to control men's grooming habits too. Augustus passed a law requiring all respectable Roman men to be clean-shaven. Beards, according to Augustus, were barbaric. They were what uncivilized people wore. Real Romans, civilized Romans, had smooth faces. Now, this might not sound like a big deal to us today, but think about what this meant practically. This was ancient Rome. They did not have safety razors or shaving cream. Shaving meant going to a barber who would scrape your face with a sharp bronze or iron blade. No numbing agents, no smooth glide strips, just metal on skin. It was painful, it was time-consuming, and it was expensive. But if you wanted to be taken seriously in Roman society, if you wanted to hold public office or be respected in business, you had to show up with a smooth face. Your beard became a political statement. The Greek philosopher Plutarch tells us a story about Scipio Africanus, a Roman general who lived before Augustus, but who shared similar views about beards. Scipio made it a point to shave every single day, even when he was on military campaigns in the middle of hostile territory. He wanted his soldiers to see that civilization and discipline meant maintaining Roman standards, even in the wilderness. That is some serious dedication to grooming. But not everyone went along with these fashion laws happily. We have records of Romans being prosecuted for showing up to public events in the wrong clothing. There is a famous story of a man who wore a dark toga to a public festival. Dark togas were for funerals and mourning, and he was immediately called out and humiliated in front of the crowd. The message was clear. Your clothes are not just about you, they are about maintaining the social order. And here is what fascinates me about all of this. The Romans were not stupid. They were one of the most advanced civilizations in human history. They built aqueducts, roads, and legal systems that we still study today. But they were absolutely obsessed with using appearance to maintain social hierarchy. Why? Because visual cues made their society work so smoothly. You could look at someone and instantly know their place in society. That man in the purple striped toga, senator. That man in the plain white toga, citizen but not nobility. That man in a tunic with no toga, non-citizen or slave. Or the woman with excessive gold jewelry, breaking the law and showing dangerous ambition. The Romans believed that if everyone could dress however they wanted, social chaos would follow. They thought that a slave who dressed like a senator would start thinking like a senator, acting like a senator, demanding rights like a senator, and they were terrified of that. So they used fashion as a tool of social control. There is a story from the reign of Emperor Caligula that perfectly captures how absurd this could get. Caligula apparently once saw a man at the theatre wearing a beautiful shade of purple. Caligula became so enraged that someone dared wear his colour that he had the man beaten and his clothes confiscated on the spot. Now, Caligula was famously insane. He allegedly made his horse a senator, so maybe this is an extreme example. But it shows how seriously these fashion laws could be enforced. Here is the thing that blows my mind. We look back at these laws and think they're ridiculous. Purple, really? You are going to execute someone over a colour? But then I think about modern dress codes and I wonder if we are really that different. Sure, we do not execute people for fashion choices anymore, but we definitely still judge people based on appearance. We have dress codes at schools, offices, restaurants, and clubs. We make assumptions about people's character, intelligence, and social class based on what they wear. A person in a business suit is treated differently than a person in ripped jeans, even if they have the same level of education and competence. Is that really so different from Roman sumptuary laws? We have just made it more subtle. Instead of laws, we have social pressure. Instead of execution, we have exclusion from opportunities. The mechanism has changed, but the underlying psychology is the same. We use appearance to categorize people and maintain social structures. Think about school uniforms. The argument is always that uniforms create equality, that they prevent kids from being judged by their clothes. But what are uniforms except sumptuary laws for children? We are literally telling young people, you cannot choose what to wear because we have decided that uniformity is more important than individual expression. Now, I am not saying school uniforms are evil, there are good arguments for them, but let us at least acknowledge that the impulse behind them is the same impulse that made Roman emperors ban purple togas. It is about control, about maintaining order through appearance, and the beard thing still relevant. Many modern corporations have grooming policies. Some jobs require men to be clean-shaven for safety reasons, which makes sense, but others require it just because beards are seen as unprofessional. We are still making the same judgments Augustus made 2,000 years ago, that facial hair somehow indicates character or competence. What I find most interesting is that these Roman fashion laws did not actually work in the long run. By the late Roman Empire, sumptuary laws had become so unpopular and so difficult to enforce that they were largely ignored. People found ways around them. They would wear purple in private. They would use slightly different shades that were technically not Tyrian purple. They would grow beards and claim Greek heritage, since Greeks were allowed to have beards under Roman law. The lesson here is that you cannot control human nature through clothing regulations. People will always want to express themselves, to show their status, to be beautiful or impressive or different. You can pass all the laws you want, but eventually human creativity and desire for self-expression will find a way around them. So what did Rome's fashion police teach us? First, that using appearance to maintain social hierarchy is as old as civilization itself, and we have not moved past it as much as we like to think. Second, that laws based on arbitrary distinctions, like colour or facial hair, are ultimately doomed to fail because they fight against human nature. And third, that freedom of expression, including the freedom to wear what you want, is actually a revolutionary concept. It is not a small thing. It is a direct challenge to systems of control that have existed for thousands of years. As we move forward in our journey through history's strangest laws, I want you to remember this. The Romans did not create fashion laws because they were stupid or cruel. They created them because they genuinely believed that controlling appearance was essential to maintaining their empire. They thought that if they let go of these controls, everything would fall apart, and you know what? They were partially right. When the empire did start to crumble, one of the signs was that people stopped following sumptuary laws. People started dressing however they wanted, and the rigid social hierarchy that had defined Rome for centuries began to dissolve. But that empire falling was not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the old order needs to break down for something better to emerge. Sometimes people wearing whatever colour they want is not chaos. It is freedom. Now, speaking of Roman laws that seem designed to control every aspect of human life, we need to talk about what happened inside Roman homes. Because if you think fashion laws were invasive, wait until you hear what Roman fathers were legally allowed to do to their own families. We are about to explore a legal system where fathers had the power of life and death over their children, where wives could become property, and where family law was so extreme it makes modern custody battles look tame. Trust me, this next part will make you grateful you were not born into a Roman household. The home, for most of us, it is supposed to be a safe place, a sanctuary where we are protected and loved. But in ancient Rome, your home could be the most dangerous place you ever lived, especially if you were unlucky enough to be born to the wrong father. Because Roman law gave fathers a power so absolute, so terrifying that it would make modern parents gasp in horror. It was called patria potestas, which translates roughly to the power of the father. And trust me, they were not exaggerating with that name. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had an argument with your parents about something they wanted you to do? Maybe they wanted you to study engineering when you wanted to be an artist, or they disapproved of the person you were dating. Frustrating, right? But ultimately, as an adult, you get to make your own choices. Now imagine if your father had the legal right to kill you for disobedience. Not disown you, not cut you off financially, actually kill you. And it would be completely legal. That was the reality of patria potestas in early Rome. Here is how extreme this law was. A Roman father, and it was always the father, mothers had no legal power in this system, had complete authority over everyone in his household. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, even his adult sons who were married with families of their own. As long as the patriarch was alive, everyone under his roof was essentially his property. He could decide who they married, he could decide what jobs they took, he could take all the money they earned, and if they displeased him, he could punish them however he saw fit, up to and including execution. The ancient Roman historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century before Christ, described this power with shocking clarity. He wrote that Roman law gave the father absolute power over his son for his whole life, whether he decided on imprisonment, flogging, putting him to work in chains in the fields, or putting him to death. And that was not just for young children. Your father held this power over you even when you were 40 years old, even when you had your own children, even when you were a respected member of society. As long as your father lived, you were under his absolute control. Can you imagine that? Picture being a 35-year-old Roman soldier who has fought in wars, commanded troops, and earned medals for bravery. You come home from a victorious campaign, and your 70-year-old father decides you have dishonored the family somehow. Maybe you married someone he disapproved of. Maybe you made a business decision he did not like, and he has the legal right to drag you into the courtyard and have you executed. No trial, no appeal, just his word as the family patriarch. Now, before you think the Romans were complete monsters, I should mention that most fathers did not actually exercise this extreme power. Social pressure and family honor usually prevented fathers from going around murdering their adult children. But the fact that they legally could do it shaped everything about Roman family dynamics. It created a system where fear and obedience were baked into the very structure of family life. But wait, it gets stranger. Roman fathers could not just kill their children, they could also sell them. Yes, you heard that correctly, sell them, like property. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code from around 450 before Christ, explicitly stated that a father could sell his child into slavery. And here is the truly bizarre part. The law specified that if a father sold his son 3 times, only then would the son be legally free from his father's power. Think about the logic here. The first time you are sold, you work off whatever debt or arrangement was made and you come back to your father. Second time, same thing. But if your father sells you a third time, the law apparently decided that was too much and you were finally granted independence. It is like the Roman legal system was saying, okay, we will let you abuse your power twice, but 3 times means you clearly do not deserve to be a father anymore. This created some incredibly twisted situations. There are records of Roman fathers using this law strategically. Some fathers would sell their sons to work for wealthy families, pocket the money, then buy them back when the work was done. It was essentially renting out your children for profit. Other fathers would sell their sons to creditors to pay off debts, treating their own children as collateral for loans. But as bad as it was for sons, the situation for daughters and wives was somehow even worse. Let me tell you about one of the strangest property laws in Roman history. When a Roman woman married, she did not just join her husband's family, she legally became his property. And the way this happened was almost comically specific. If a woman lived continuously in her husband's home for 1 full year, she automatically became his legal possession, just like his furniture or his slaves. But here is where it gets interesting. Roman women figured out a loophole. The law said 1 continuous year. So what did smart Roman women do? Once a year, they would leave their husband's house for 3 consecutive nights. They would go stay with relatives or friends anywhere but home, and by interrupting that continuous year, they maintained their legal independence. It was called the Trinoctium, the 3 nights, and it became a regular ritual for Roman women who wanted to preserve some autonomy. Can you picture this? Every year, probably marked on some ancient Roman calendar, wives across the empire would pack a bag and leave for 3 nights. Husbands knew it was coming. It was just part of marriage. Oh, it is that time of year again when my wife legally has to leave so she does not become my property. It is absurd, but it was also a clever way for women to work within an oppressive system to maintain whatever small freedoms they could. Now, let us talk about adultery law, because this is where Roman family law gets truly dark. If a Roman husband caught his wife having an affair, the law did not just permit him to be angry, it required him to act. and the way he had to act was public and humiliating for everyone involved. First, the husband had to physically catch them in the act. Then he had 20 hours, literally 20 hours, they were specific about this, to call together as many neighbours, friends and family members as possible to come witness what he had found. Imagine that scene. Your neighbour runs into the street at midnight shouting, "Come quickly, my wife is with another man. Everyone needs to see this." And people actually had to come look. It was legally required testimony. But it gets worse. Within 3 days, the husband had to make a public declaration describing exactly what he found, where it happened, who the other man was, every mortifying detail. This was not about justice, this was about public humiliation as punishment. The Romans wanted everyone in the community to know what happened, to shame both the wife and her lover. And the legal consequences? If the lover was a slave or prostitute, the husband could kill him on the spot, no questions asked. But if the lover was a Roman citizen, the husband needed permission from his father-in-law. That is right. He had to ask his wife's father if he could take revenge on the man who slept with his daughter. Family dynamics must have been incredibly awkward after that conversation. The husband was also legally required to divorce his wife immediately, or else he would be charged with pimping. The logic was that if you knew your wife was unfaithful and you stayed married to her, you must be profiting from her affairs somehow. The law forced you to divorce her, whether you wanted to or not. You lost your marriage either way. But here is what bothers me most about this law. The punishment for the wife's lover depended on his social class. Kill a slave? Fine. Kill a citizen? Need permission. What about the wife? She faced divorce, public shame, loss of her dowry, and often exile from her family. Her life was destroyed. Meanwhile, if the husband had affairs, which many Roman men did openly, there was no equivalent law, no public declarations, no forced divorce. The double standard was not just accepted, it was written into law. There is a famous story that illustrates how these laws could tear families apart. In 9 before Christ, the Emperor Augustus, yes, the same Augustus who was obsessed with beards, was trying to promote traditional family values. He passed a law called the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, which made adultery not just a family matter, but a criminal offence against the state. He wanted to show that he was serious about morality, but then his own daughter, Julia, was caught in multiple affairs. Augustus, bound by the law he himself had created, had to prosecute his own daughter publicly. He exiled her to a tiny island where she lived in isolation for years. According to the historian Suetonius, Augustus was so ashamed that he refused to see her ever again and would not even speak her name. The law he created to strengthen families ended up destroying his own. What strikes me about all these Roman family laws is how much they were about control, not protection. Modern family law, at least in theory, is designed to protect the vulnerable, children, victims of abuse, people who cannot defend themselves. But Roman family law was designed to protect the power structure. It ensured that fathers stayed powerful, that families stayed hierarchical, that everyone knew their place. And the Romans defended this system. They genuinely believed that strong families required absolute paternal authority. They looked at societies where fathers had less power and saw chaos and weakness. They thought their system created strong citizens and a strong empire. And maybe they were right in a twisted way. Rome did last for centuries, but at what cost? How many children lived in fear of their fathers? How many women had to perform the annual 3-night ritual just to maintain basic autonomy? How many families were destroyed by laws that valued control over compassion? Here is what fascinates me. These laws lasted for centuries, but they did slowly change. By the time we get to the later Roman Empire, around the 4th and 5th centuries in the Common Era, Patria potestas had been significantly weakened. Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity, started restricting what fathers could do to their children. He said fathers could no longer kill their adult sons. He acknowledged that children could own property independently. The absolute power of the father was being dismantled piece by piece. Why? Because society evolved. Because new philosophies, including Christianity, taught that every human had inherent dignity. Because women pushed back against unjust laws. Because sons who survived their father's abuses remembered that trauma and vowed to treat their own children differently. Change happened slowly over centuries, but it happened. And that gives me hope, honestly, because we still have unjust family laws today. We still have places where women are treated as property, where parents have too much control over adult children, where domestic abuse is ignored or excused. But Rome shows us that even systems that seem permanent can change. Even laws that have existed for centuries can be overturned. It just takes people being willing to say, this is wrong and we deserve better. So what can we learn from Rome's family law nightmare? First, that control is not love. A father who rules his family through fear may maintain order, but he's not building relationships, he is building resentment and trauma. Second, that legal power without accountability leads to abuse. When one person has absolute authority over another with no oversight, bad things happen. And third, that the most important unit of society is not the powerful patriarch. It is the individual human being with inherent rights and dignity. Think about your own family. Think about how different your life would be under Roman law. Would you have the freedom to choose your career, your spouse, your life path? Or would you be trapped under someone else's absolute power? But as oppressive as Roman family law was, at least it was trying to impose some kind of order on society, however twisted. What happens when lawmakers decide to abandon reason entirely? What happens when laws are based not on logic or justice but on superstition, bizarre beliefs, and magical thinking? That is where we are heading next. We are leaving Rome and travelling to medieval Europe, where the legal system mixed with religion, fear, and absurdity in ways that would produce some of the strangest trials in human history. Prepare yourself for laws about shoe length, fortune-telling by water, and legal battles that make Roman family courts look rational by comparison. The medieval mind was a strange place, and their laws reflected that perfectly. If you thought the Romans were unreasonable, buckle up, because we're about to enter a period of history where logic took a vacation and never came back. The Middle Ages, that stretch of roughly 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, gave us castles, knights, and some of the most spectacularly bizarre laws humanity has ever concocted. We are talking about a legal system that believed God would intervene in court cases where your shoes could be illegal and where being accused of a crime meant you might be thrown into a river to see if you floated. Welcome to medieval Europe, where justice was less about evidence and more about divine intervention and pure insanity. Let me start with something that sounds too ridiculous to be real, but I promise you it absolutely was. In medieval France, men's fashion reached a level of absurdity that eventually required government intervention. I am talking about shoes, specifically shoes with pointed toes. Now, you might be thinking, pointed shoes? That is kind of normal, but these were not just pointed. These shoes, called poulaines, had toes so long that they became a legitimate public safety hazard. Picture this. It is the 1400s in France, and you are a nobleman trying to show off your wealth and status. Regular shoes are for peasants. You need something that screams, I am so rich, I do not need to walk anywhere practical. So you commission a shoemaker to create shoes with pointed toes. but not just a little point. We're talking about toes that extended 6 inches, 12 inches, sometimes up to 2 feet beyond the actual foot. Yes, 2 feet of shoe extending out in front of you. Now, how do you walk in shoes with 2-foot-long pointed toes? You do not. Not normally, anyway. These shoes were so impractical that men had to tie the tips of their shoes to their knees with chains or ribbons just to be able to walk without tripping. Imagine that. You wake up in the morning, get dressed, and then you have to literally chain your shoes to your legs just to move around. The fashion became so extreme that the French government finally said enough is enough. In 1363, King Charles V issued a decree limiting the length of shoe toes based on social class. Commoners could have shoes with toes up to 6 inches long, gentlemen could go up to 12 inches, but only princes and nobles of the highest rank could wear the ridiculously long 2-foot versions. The government was literally regulating shoe length based on your social status. But here is the part that kills me. Even with these laws in place, men kept trying to push the limits. There are records of French tailors being fined and jailed for making shoes that were too long for their customers' social class. Court documents describe men being publicly humiliated for wearing shoes above their station. Your footwear became evidence of your social climbing ambitions, and if you wore shoes that were too fancy for your rank, you were not just fashion-forward, you were a criminal. Why did this matter so much? Because in medieval society, everything visible had to reflect the social order. If a merchant could wear the same shoes as a duke, how would people know who to bow to? The system depended on visible markers of hierarchy, and when men started competing through increasingly ridiculous shoe lengths, the government had to step in because the entire social system was wobbling on these absurdly pointed foundations. Now, let us travel across the English Channel to England, where they had their own obsession with controlling appearance. But this one had a darker reason behind it. In 1313, King Edward II passed a law that is still technically on the books today. The law states that it is illegal to wear a suit of armour inside the Houses of Parliament. On the surface, this might seem reasonable. Nobody wants armed and armoured knights walking around in government buildings, right? But the story behind this law reveals just how paranoid and violent medieval politics could be. Edward II was not a popular king. His reign was plagued by rebellions, military defeats, and constant challenges to his authority from powerful nobles. These nobles would show up to Parliament sessions in full armour, not because they were about to go to battle, but as an intimidation tactic. Imagine being a member of Parliament trying to debate policy, and across the room sits a baron in full plate armour with a sword at his side. The message was clear: vote the way I want, or there might be consequences. It was political intimidation through fashion, and Edward was desperate to stop it. So he banned armour in Parliament, hoping it would reduce the physical threat that hung over every legislative session. The law did not save him. In 1327, Edward was overthrown by his own wife and her lover, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and allegedly murdered in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. But I will spare you those details. The point is, even laws designed to protect the king could not save him from medieval political violence. But that law about armour, still technically illegal to wear in Parliament today. If you ever visit the British Parliament, leave your chainmail at home. But medieval laws about appearance, as strange as they were, pale in comparison to how medieval courts actually determined guilt or innocence. This is where we enter truly bizarre territory. Have you ever heard of trial by ordeal? It was a legal practice used throughout medieval Europe based on a simple but completely insane premise. If you were innocent, God would protect you from harm, and if you were guilty, God would let you suffer. Let me explain how this worked with the most famous example, trial by water, also called the swimming test. If you were accused of a crime, especially witchcraft, you would be tied up, hands bound to feet, and thrown into a river or pond. The logic went like this. Water is pure and holy because it is used in baptism. Therefore, pure holy water would reject evil. So if you were guilty, you would float, because the water was rejecting your sinful body. If you were innocent, you would sink, because the water was accepting you. Now, take a moment to appreciate the horrifying problem with this test. If you were guilty and floated, they would pull you out and execute you for your crime. But if you were innocent and sank, you would drown. Either way, you died. Your only hope was that someone would pull you out before you drowned, and then you would be declared innocent. But there was no standard for how long they should wait. Some accounts describe people being underwater for minutes before being retrieved, if they were retrieved at all. The historian Robert Bartlett, in his book Trial by Fire and Water, documents dozens of these cases from medieval court records. In one case from 1122 in England, a woman named Elfgifu was accused of adultery. She was thrown into a pond, and when she sank, she was declared innocent. They pulled her out unconscious, and she later died from the ordeal. But legally, she died innocent. So I suppose that was supposed to be comforting to her family. This was not some rare practice used only in extreme cases. Trial by ordeal was a standard legal procedure across medieval Europe for centuries. There were different versions. Trial by fire meant holding a red-hot iron bar and walking a certain number of steps, then having your burns examined 3 days later. If they were healing well, you were innocent. If they got infected, which they almost always did, you were guilty. Trial by combat allowed accused and accuser to fight each other, with the winner being declared right by God. This one at least made some logical sense if you assumed combat skill indicated divine favour. But it also meant that being a good fighter made you legally correct, which is a terrifying basis for a justice system. The craziest part? Medieval people genuinely believed this worked. They thought God was actively intervening in these trials, that divine judgment was being passed in real time. The church endorsed these practices. Priests would bless the water before trials, pray over the hot irons, and sanctify the combat grounds. The entire religious establishment supported the idea that you could determine guilt through superstition and torture. But here is something fascinating that historians have discovered. There is evidence that some medieval priests secretly sabotaged these trials to help innocent people survive. A monk named Raoul Glaber, writing in the 1100s, describes how some priests would coat iron bars with protective substances to reduce burns, or instruct people how to hold hot objects to minimize injury. These priests knew the system was unjust, but they could not challenge it directly without being accused of heresy. So they worked within it, quietly helping people survive the insanity. Now, let us talk about witchcraft accusations, because this is where medieval legal madness reached its peak. The irony is that the early medieval church actually did not believe in witches. Around 800 in the Common Era, a document called the Canon Episcopi stated that believing in witches flying through the air was superstitious nonsense. The church said people who claimed to see witches were deluded. But by the 1500s, everything had flipped. The church not only believed in witches, they were actively hunting them. What changed? Fear, politics, and a document called the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by 2 German monks. This book became the witch hunter's manual, describing how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches, and the evidence it presented was absolutely insane. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, you could identify a witch by looking for devil's marks on their body, moles, birthmarks, any unusual skin feature. Witch hunters would strip accused women naked and examine every inch of their bodies looking for these marks. If they found one, that was evidence of witchcraft. If they did not find one, they would say the witch was hiding it through magic. But here is one of the most disturbing details that gets overlooked. The Malleus Maleficarum and other witch-hunting texts suggested that overweight people, especially women, were more likely to be witches. The reasoning was that witches attended midnight feasts with the devil where they ate luxuriously. Therefore, if a woman was heavier than normal for a peasant of that era, she must be eating at these demonic banquets. Think about what this meant. In an era when most people were struggling to get enough food, when famine was common and most people were thin from malnutrition, being well-fed became evidence of devil worship. Your body size became proof of your guilt. Women who were simply healthy or naturally heavier were accused of witchcraft and subjected to torture and execution. This is body shaming as legal evidence, and it resulted in thousands of deaths. Modern historians estimate that between 40,000 and 100,000 people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1450 and 1750. And body weight was one of many arbitrary physical characteristics used as evidence against them. The witch trials also used trial by water extensively. Women accused of witchcraft would be tied up and thrown into water. If they floated, they were witches. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent but also dead. It is the same insane logic, but now specifically weaponized against women. One documented case from 1612 in Lancashire, England, tells the story of Janet Preston, who was accused of witchcraft partly because she was described in court documents as unusually plump for a woman of her station. During her trial, witnesses testified that she must be eating well somehow, implying demonic assistance. She was convicted and hanged. Her crime? Being healthy-looking while poor. What disturbs me most about medieval justice is how it took the most human characteristics, fear, jealousy, misunderstanding, and turned them into legal procedures. Someone in your village does not like you? Accuse them of witchcraft. A woman rejects a man's advances? She must be a witch. Your neighbour's crops are better than yours. Probably made a deal with the devil. There was no presumption of innocence. The accusation itself was almost proof of guilt. If someone accused you of witchcraft and you denied it, that was taken as evidence that you were a witch trying to hide. If you confessed under torture, which most people eventually did, that proved you were a witch. There was no way to win. Compare this to modern legal systems, at least in democratic countries. We have the presumption of innocence. We have the right to face our accusers. We have standards of evidence. We do not throw people in rivers to see if they float. We do not assume body weight indicates criminal behaviour, though sadly bias based on appearance absolutely still exists in modern courts. But at least it is not official policy. The medieval period teaches us something crucial about human nature and law. When you combine fear, superstition, religious authority, and unchecked power, you create systems that can justify any horror. The people implementing these laws were not monsters. They genuinely believed they were protecting their communities from evil. They thought they were doing the right thing. That is what makes it so terrifying. Good intentions without reason, without evidence, without skepticism, can create the worst injustices. The witch hunters believed they were heroes. The priests blessing the trial by ordeal believed they were serving God. The nobles enforcing shoe-length laws believed they were maintaining social order. They were all wrong, but they were all certain they were right. So what do we take from this madness? First, that laws based on superstition rather than evidence are always unjust. Second, that the burden of proof should always be on the accuser, never on the accused. And third, that we should be deeply skeptical of any legal system that claims divine authority or absolute certainty. Because once you convince yourself that God is on your side, you can justify anything. The medieval period eventually ended. The Renaissance brought renewed emphasis on reason, science, and evidence-based thinking. The Enlightenment pushed back against superstition and arbitrary authority. But it took centuries, and countless people died in the meantime, and honestly, we are still fighting these battles today. We still see laws based on fear rather than evidence. We still see people accused and convicted in the court of public opinion before any trial happens. We still have biases about appearance affecting legal outcomes. The medieval mind is not as far behind us as we like to think. But if medieval humans created laws about shoe length and divine water tests, at least they were focused on humans, right? Well, not quite. Because our next chapter reveals that throughout history humans have been absolutely obsessed with creating laws about animals. And I am not talking about animal protection laws, though those exist too. I am talking about laws so bizarre, so specific, and so hilariously strange that you will wonder what was happening in these towns that made lawmakers think, we need a rule about this immediately. From moose in airplanes to ice cream theft involving horses, the animal laws of history will make everything we have covered so far seem almost reasonable. Almost. There is something uniquely human about our relationship with animals. We love them, we fear them, we depend on them, and apparently we create the most absurdly specific laws about them. Throughout history, lawmakers have sat in government chambers, surrounded by serious documents and important matters of state, and thought to themselves, you know what we really need? A law about what you can and cannot do with a moose. And then they actually wrote it down and made it official policy. Tonight, we are diving into the bizarre world of animal laws, where ice cream becomes a tool for horse theft, where bears are banned from wrestling matches, and where flying moose become a legitimate legislative concern. Let me start with Alaska, because Alaska has not one but multiple laws about moose that will make you question everything you thought you knew about legal reasoning. The first law states that it is illegal to push a living moose out of a moving airplane. Yes, you heard that correctly. Someone at some point in Alaskan history was apparently pushing moose out of airplanes frequently enough that the government had to step in and say, okay, we need to make this officially illegal. Now I know what you are thinking. Who was doing this? And more importantly, why? And honestly, the historical records are frustratingly vague on the details. But here is what we can piece together. In the early to mid-20th century, Alaska was still largely wilderness. Aviation was becoming more common as a way to access remote areas. People were transporting all kinds of cargo by small planes, including sometimes livestock. And apparently at some point, someone thought it would be a good idea to solve the problem of landing a plane with a moose on board by simply pushing the moose out mid-flight. The mental image alone is incredible. Picture a small bush plane flying over the Alaskan wilderness. Inside, a moose, which can weigh up to 1,500 pounds, is somehow crammed into the cargo area. The pilot looks back and thinks, you know what would make this landing easier? No moose. And so they just open the door and shove. The moose tumbles out, probably extremely confused about how its day has taken this turn, and plummets toward the ground. Was this happening regularly? Probably not. But it apparently happened enough times, or at least once in a spectacular enough fashion, that Alaska legislators decided they needed to address it. And that is the thing about weird laws. They often reveal the one bizarre incident that made someone say, we cannot let this happen again. But Alaska was not done with moose legislation. They also passed a law making it illegal to give alcohol to a moose, and this one, believe it or not, has a darker history behind it. In the 1930s and 40s, there were documented cases of people in Alaska intentionally getting moose drunk as a form of entertainment. They would leave out fermented fruit or even direct alcohol, wait for moose to consume it, and then watch the results. Now, you might think drunk moose would be funny in a harmless way, But a drunk moose is actually terrifying. Moose are already dangerous animals. They are massive, unpredictable, and responsible for more injuries in Alaska than bears. A bull moose can stand 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh over 1,000 pounds. When they are sober, they can charge at 35 miles per hour and have been known to kick predators to death with their powerful hooves. Now add alcohol to that equation. A drunk moose loses what little caution it normally has around humans. It becomes aggressive, confused, and even more unpredictable. There are records from the 1940s of drunk moose wandering into towns, damaging property, and attacking people. In one infamous incident in Anchorage, a moose that had eaten fermented crab apples terrorized the neighborhood for hours, charging at cars and trying to break into a shed. The authorities who responded quickly realized that dealing with a drunk, angry moose is nearly impossible. You cannot reason with it. You cannot easily tranquilize a moving target that large, and you definitely do not want to shoot it in a residential area. So they just had to wait for it to sober up and wander off, all while keeping people safe from the massive intoxicated animal. After several incidents like this, Alaska finally made it official: stop getting the moose drunk. And while it sounds funny, the law actually makes sense from a public safety perspective. It is essentially saying do not create a situation where a 1,500-pound wild animal becomes an unpredictable danger. That is reasonable. It is just the specificity of the law that makes it hilarious. Now let us travel south to Georgia, where they dealt with a very different kind of animal-related crime. In Georgia, there is a law, still on the books today, that makes it illegal to carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket on Sundays. And the story behind this law is absolutely wild. In the 1800s, before automobiles became common, horses were the primary mode of transportation, and naturally, horse theft was a serious problem. Stealing someone's horse was not just stealing their property, it was stealing their mobility, their livelihood, their connection to the wider world. Horse thieves were treated seriously by the law, often facing severe punishment, including hanging in some cases. But clever criminals found a loophole. You see, if you were caught actively stealing a horse, pulling it from someone's property or breaking into a stable, that was clearly theft. But what if the horse followed you willingly? What if the horse just decided to leave with you of its own accord? Then technically you had not stolen it. The horse had chosen to accompany you. So creative horse thieves developed a method. They would take something horses loved, and apparently horses in the 1800s loved ice cream just as much as we do, and they would put an ice cream cone in their back pocket. Then they would walk past a stable or a field where horses were kept. The horse would smell the ice cream, become interested, and follow the person with the delicious-smelling treat. The thief would walk to their own property or out of town with the horse happily trailing behind, and then claim the horse had simply followed them. When caught, they would say, "I did not steal this horse, officer. Look, I was just walking along and this horse decided to follow me. What could I do?" And because they had not actually used force or broken into property, it was harder to prosecute them for theft. Georgia lawmakers caught on to this scheme and decided to close the loophole in the most specific way possible. They made it illegal to carry ice cream in your back pocket, particularly on Sundays when people were at church and their horses were left unattended. The logic was, the only reason you would carry ice cream in your back pocket, instead of eating it like a normal person, is if you're trying to lure a horse. Therefore, back pocket ice cream equals attempted horse theft. It is brilliant in its specificity and completely absurd at the same time. Imagine being the legislator who proposed this. "Gentlemen, I have identified the problem. These criminals are weaponizing frozen dairy products. We must act immediately." And everyone else in the room nodded seriously and voted yes. The law worked, apparently. There is no evidence of an ice cream-based horse theft epidemic after the law passed, but the law was never repealed, so technically, right now, if you are in Georgia on a Sunday with a waffle cone in your back pocket, you are breaking a law that is over a century old. Let us move to Louisiana, where they decided to tackle a problem that honestly sounds more like a fever dream than a real issue: bear wrestling. Yes, in Louisiana it is illegal to wrestle a bear. And before you laugh, this law exists because bear wrestling was actually a real form of entertainment in the American South throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Traveling shows would feature wrestling matches between humans and bears. The bears were usually declawed, muzzled, and drugged to make them less dangerous, but they were still massive wild animals that could seriously injure or kill a person. These matches were advertised as tests of human strength and bravery, with men claiming they could take down a bear with their bare hands. The reality was much darker. The bears were abused, mistreated, and lived in horrible conditions. They were often kept in tiny cages between shows, fed poorly, and trained through beatings and starvation. The wrestling matches were not fair fights. They were cruel spectacles where drugged, weakened bears were forced to participate in degrading performances. By the mid-20th century, animal welfare concerns started growing. People began to recognize that this was not entertainment, it was torture. Louisiana passed a law in 1972 specifically banning bear wrestling and any similar events involving wrestling or fighting bears for public amusement. The law included hefty fines and potential jail time for organizers. What I find interesting is how specific the law is. It does not just say you cannot abuse bears, it specifically says you cannot wrestle them or make them participate in wrestling matches. This suggests that when lawmakers were drafting the bill, they had to account for people trying to find loopholes. Well, the bear is not wrestling, it is just aggressive hugging. So they made it crystal clear. No wrestling, no fighting, no physical confrontations between humans and bears for entertainment purposes. And honestly, this is one of the rare weird laws where I think, good, that needed to be illegal. Sometimes bizarre-sounding laws exist for very good reasons. Now let me tell you about one of my favourite weird animal law stories, because it involves a bathtub, a donkey, and a natural disaster. This one comes from Arizona in the 1920s. There is a law in Kingman, Arizona, that specifically prohibits allowing a donkey to sleep in a bathtub, and the story behind this law is pure comedy mixed with tragedy. In 1924, a rancher in Kingman had a donkey that he was quite fond of. This donkey, for reasons that are lost to history, loved sleeping in an old abandoned bathtub on the rancher's property. The rancher thought it was harmless and kind of funny, so he let the donkey continue this unusual sleeping arrangement. The donkey would climb into the bathtub every night and sleep there peacefully. Then one night, disaster struck. A dam burst upstream and a flash flood swept through the area. The rushing water hit the rancher's property, and because the bathtub was not secured to anything, it was picked up by the flood, with the donkey still inside it. Imagine this poor donkey waking up to find itself suddenly surfing down a raging river in a bathtub. The bathtub-donkey combination floated downstream, eventually getting lodged against a bridge. The donkey was braying in distress, the bathtub was blocking part of the waterway, and the entire town had to mobilize a rescue operation. Multiple people, emergency resources, and hours of effort went into saving this donkey from its bathtub predicament. The town was not amused. The rescue had been expensive, dangerous, and could have been completely avoided if the rancher had just let his donkey sleep on the ground like a normal animal. So the Kingman City Council passed an ordinance. From this day forward, donkeys are not allowed to sleep in bathtubs within city limits. It is such a specific response to such a bizarre incident that you have to love it. The lawmakers could have passed a general law about securing outdoor furniture or preventing animals from accessing dangerous items. But no, they went straight for the jugular. Donkeys and bathtubs are now officially incompatible by law. One more quick one before we move on. In San Francisco, there is an old law that prohibits using elephants to plow cotton fields. Now there are several questions here. First, why would you use an elephant to plow a field when oxen and horses work perfectly well? Second, when was San Francisco growing cotton? And third, who had access to elephants in 19th century California? The answer to all of these questions is, it probably never actually happened. This law is likely one of those legislative jokes or placeholder laws that got left on the books. Sometimes lawmakers would propose ridiculous laws as satire or as examples during debates about proper legislative language. And occasionally these joke laws would accidentally get passed or would be left in the legal code after the actual discussion had moved on. But the fact that it exists tells us something interesting about how laws accumulate over time. Once something is written into law, it takes effort to remove it. You need someone to notice it, care enough to propose its repeal, and get enough support to actually remove it. For most weird old laws, that never happens. They just sit there, technically enforceable, waiting for someone to accidentally violate them. So what do all these animal laws teach us? First, that laws are often reactive rather than proactive. Alaska did not ban pushing moose out of planes until someone actually did it. Georgia did not ban back pocket ice cream until horse thieves started using it. We create laws in response to problems, which means weird laws often reveal weird problems. Second, these laws show us that specificity in law can be both necessary and ridiculous. When you make a law too general, people find loopholes. But when you make it too specific, it sounds absurd. The balance is tricky. Third, and maybe most importantly, these laws reveal our complicated relationship with animals. We love them enough to create laws protecting them from being wrestled or thrown out of planes. But we also love them enough that we will use ice cream to steal them. We are capable of both tremendous kindness and casual cruelty toward animals, sometimes in the same society, sometimes even in the same person. And I think that says something profound about human nature. We are constantly trying to codify behavior that is inherently messy and contradictory. We want rules that make sense, but life keeps presenting situations that rules were never designed to handle. What do you do when you catch someone with a donkey in a bathtub during a flood? You could never have predicted that specific scenario, but once it happens, you need a response. That is the challenge of lawmaking. You're trying to create order in a fundamentally chaotic world. You're trying to anticipate human behavior when humans are endlessly creative at finding new ways to be ridiculous. And sometimes the best you can do is write down, okay, from now on this specific absurd thing is not allowed, and hope that covers it. But if you think animal laws are strange, wait until you see what humans have legislated about food. Because apparently we cannot even trust ourselves to eat correctly without government supervision. We are about to explore laws about pickles that must bounce, chicken that must be consumed with bare hands, and wine that absolutely cannot be served in certain types of cups. The intersection of law and food has produced some of the most delightfully bizarre regulations in human history, and honestly some of them are still enforced today. Let us see what happens when the government decides your dinner is their business. Food is universal. Every human culture that has ever existed has developed customs, traditions, and strong opinions about what we eat and how we eat it. But some societies have taken this one step further, deciding that the government needs to officially regulate not just food safety, but the proper way to consume a pickle, the acceptable vessels for wine, and whether you're sober enough to play bingo. Yes, you heard that last one correctly. We are about to explore a world where lawmakers looked at dinner plates and thought, This needs more rules. And somehow many of these laws are still technically enforceable today. Let us start with what might be the most delightfully scientific food law ever created. Connecticut's bouncing pickle test. I need you to picture this scene. It is the early 1940s in Connecticut. World War II is raging overseas, the country is rationing food, and two men are arrested for selling pickles. Not just any pickles, bad pickles. Spoiled, mushy, potentially dangerous pickles. But here is the problem. Connecticut did not have clear food safety standards for pickles. How do you prove in court that a pickle is too spoiled to sell? The state food commissioner, whoever this genius was, came up with a solution that sounds like something from a cartoon. He declared that a proper pickle, a pickle that is safe and fit for human consumption, must be firm enough to bounce when dropped from a height of 1 foot. Yes, bounce, like a rubber ball. If you drop a pickle from 12 inches and it bounces, it passes the test and can be sold. If it splats, flops, or just sits there looking sad and muchy, it fails and cannot be sold to the public. Now, you're probably wondering, does this actually work as a food safety measure? And surprisingly, yes, kind of. When cucumbers are properly pickled, the fermentation process and vinegar create a firm texture. The pickle becomes crisp and structured. If a pickle is properly preserved, it retains that firmness. But if the pickling process was done incorrectly, or if the pickle has started to spoil, it loses that structural integrity. It becomes soft, mushy, and yes, unable to bounce. So the bounce test is actually a surprisingly effective quick check for pickle quality. It is not perfect. A pickle could theoretically pass the bounce test and still have other problems. But as a basic field test that anyone can perform without laboratory equipment, it is brilliant in its simplicity. Drop pickle, does it bounce? Pass, does it go splat? Fail. Even a child could administer this test. The law became official state policy, and for decades, Connecticut food inspectors would show up to markets and factories with their pickles and a measuring stick. They would hold pickles exactly 1 foot above a surface, release them, and watch. I imagine this was either the best or worst part of their job, depending on how you feel about pickles and the inherent comedy of official pickle bouncing. And here is the part that kills me. This law is still on the books. Technically right now, if you're selling pickles in Connecticut, they need to pass the bounce test. Now, modern food safety standards have evolved far beyond pickle bouncing. We have laboratory tests, bacterial counts, pH measurements, and all sorts of scientific methods for ensuring food safety. But the bounce test law was never officially repealed, so it remains part of Connecticut's legal code, a reminder of a simpler time when food safety could be determined by physics and a 1 foot drop. Can you imagine being a modern pickle company in Connecticut and having an inspector show up with a ruler? Sir, I need to perform the official bounce test on your products. It sounds absurd, but it is technically still legal procedure. Now let us travel south to Gainesville, Georgia, where they take their chicken very seriously. Gainesville has declared itself the poultry capital of the world, and they have a law to prove it. Within the Gainesville city limits, it is illegal to eat fried chicken with anything other than your bare hands. Forks? Illegal. Knives? Illegal. Chopsticks? Definitely illegal. If you want to eat fried chicken in Gainesville, you better be ready to get your hands greasy, because that's the only legal way to do it. This law was passed in 1961 as part of a publicity stunt to promote Gainesville's chicken industry. The city wanted to emphasize its connection to poultry and thought a quirky law would get attention. And it worked. The law made headlines, became a tourist attraction, and put Gainesville on the map as a chicken town. But here is where it gets interesting. In 2009, a tourist named Ginny Dietrich visited Gainesville and decided to test the law. She went to a restaurant and very deliberately ate fried chicken with a fork. The police were called, yes really, and she was jokingly arrested. The whole thing was staged for publicity, and she was given a ceremonial pardon by the mayor. But the fact that they went through this elaborate theatre shows that the law, while ridiculous, is still taken somewhat seriously as part of the town's identity. What I find fascinating is how food laws become intertwined with cultural identity. Gainesville is not actually trying to arrest people for using forks, but the law serves a purpose. It tells the world chicken is so important to us that we have laws about how to eat it. It is a statement of pride wrapped in absurdity, and honestly, there is something kind of beautiful about that. A town loves its chicken so much that it legislates the proper way to honour it. But not all food laws are about pride and publicity. Some come from much darker places. Let me tell you about Kansas and their very specific law about wine and teacups. In Kansas, it is illegal to serve wine in teacups. Regular glasses, fine. Wine glasses, perfect, but teacups, absolutely not. You will be breaking the law. This law comes from the Prohibition era in the United States, that bizarre period from 1920 to 1933, when the entire country banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Now, federal prohibition ended in 1933, but many states and localities kept their own alcohol restrictions for years, sometimes decades afterward. During Prohibition, people got creative about hiding their alcohol consumption. Speakeasies disguised themselves as legitimate businesses. People carried flasks hidden in books, canes, and hollowed-out loaves of bread. And apparently at some point someone in Kansas started serving wine in teacups to make it look like they were just having tea. The logic was simple. If a police officer or prohibition agent walked by and saw people having tea, they would not investigate further. But if they saw wine glasses, that would be obvious evidence of illegal drinking. Kansas authorities caught on to this trick and decided to close the loophole. They made it specifically illegal to serve wine in teacups. The law was designed to eliminate this method of disguise. If you were caught with wine in a teacup, you could not claim ignorance or say you thought it was tea. The vessel itself became evidence of intent to deceive. What is remarkable is that this law, created for prohibition enforcement, is still technically on the books in Kansas today. Prohibition ended almost a century ago, but the teacup law remains. Why? Because removing old laws from the books requires legislative action, and most lawmakers have better things to do than go through centuries of legal code removing outdated regulations. So the laws just accumulate layer upon layer, like geological strata of human ridiculousness. Imagine being a restaurant owner in Kansas today who wants to do a fancy tea party-themed event where you serve wine in teacups as a fun aesthetic choice. Technically, you would be breaking a law that has been on the books for 100 years. Would anyone actually enforce it? Almost certainly not, but it is still there, waiting for someone to notice. Now, speaking of alcohol and bizarre regulations, let us talk about North Carolina and their very specific rule about drinking and bingo. In North Carolina, it is illegal to operate a bingo game while intoxicated. Not play bingo while drunk, that is fine. But if you are the person running the bingo game, calling out the numbers and managing the event, you must be sworn. If you show up drunk to work your shift as a bingo caller, you're breaking the law. This law exists because bingo is actually serious business in North Carolina. Bingo games are often used as fundraisers for churches, schools, and charitable organizations. Millions of dollars can be raised through bingo games each year. And like any situation involving money and gambling, because let us be honest, bingo is a form of gambling, there is potential for fraud and manipulation. The state decided that bingo operators need to be held to a standard of accountability. If the person calling the numbers is intoxicated, they could make mistakes. They could accidentally or intentionally call wrong numbers. They could be influenced or bribed more easily. They could simply be incompetent at their job. So North Carolina said, "Listen, we take bingo seriously. If you are going to operate these games, you need to be sober while doing it." Is this law necessary? Maybe. There have been documented cases of bingo fraud, where operators manipulated games to help certain players win. Whether alcohol was involved in those cases is unclear, but the law suggests that North Carolina was not taking any chances. They wanted to make sure that bingo remained fair, transparent, and free from the kind of shenanigans that alcohol might enable. What I love about this law is how specific it is. You can be drunk while playing bingo. You can be drunk while watching bingo. You can even be drunk while walking into the bingo hall. But the moment you step behind that microphone and start pulling balls from the cage, you better be stone cold sober, because you're now operating under North Carolina gaming regulations. Now, let us travel back in time to medieval Venice, because they had food laws that were less about safety and more about social control in the most explicit way possible. Venice in the Middle Ages was a major trading port, wealthy and cosmopolitan. It was also home to a significant number of prostitutes, which the city government saw as both a practical reality and a moral problem they needed to manage. Here is where food comes in. Venetian authorities decided that they could not eliminate prostitution, so they would regulate it instead. And one of their methods was controlling what prostitutes could eat and where they could eat it. Laws were passed restricting prostitutes from eating in certain public areas or consuming certain expensive foods that might make them appear wealthier or higher status than they were. The logic was about maintaining social boundaries through consumption. If a prostitute could eat at expensive restaurants and dress well and generally appear to be a respectable woman of means, she might be mistaken for a merchant's wife or a noblewoman. The government did not want that confusion. They wanted everyone's status to be immediately visible, so they used food access as a tool of social categorization. This seems cruel and absurd to us now, but it reveals something important about how societies have used food throughout history. Food is not just nutrition, it is status, identity, belonging. When you control who can eat what and where, you are controlling social hierarchies. Medieval Venice understood this and weaponized it. The same principle appears throughout history. Sumptuary laws, which we discussed earlier, often included restrictions on food. Only certain classes could host banquets with more than a specified number of courses. Only nobility could serve certain expensive meats. These laws used food to reinforce the social order, to make sure that eating habits reflected and reinforced your place in society. Even today, we see echoes of this. Food deserts in poor neighborhoods limit access to healthy food. Expensive restaurants act as gatekeepers to social spaces. The concept of comfort food versus fine dining creates cultural boundaries. We like to think we have moved past using food as a tool of social control, but really, we have just made it less official and more subtle. So what do all these food laws teach us? First, that food safety and food culture are both considered legitimate areas for government regulation. Whether it is Connecticut making sure your pickle bounces, or Kansas preventing wine disguises, governments have always believed they have a role in managing what we eat and how we eat it. Second, these laws show how cultural values get encoded into legislation. Gainesville's fork ban is not really about forks, it is about celebrating chicken culture. North Carolina's bingo law is not just about sobriety. It is about protecting charitable fundraising and maintaining trust in community events. Third, and maybe most importantly, these laws reveal that food is never just food. It is identity, power, tradition, and politics all mixed together on a plate. When we legislate food, we are really legislating culture. We are saying this is important to us, this is how things should be done, this is who we are as a community. The question is, where is the line between reasonable food regulation and governmental overreach? We probably all agree that basic food safety laws are good. Nobody wants spoiled meat being sold at grocery stores. But do we need laws about how to eat chicken? Do we need century-old wine teacup regulations still on the books? At what point does protecting the public become policing personal choice? These are not easy questions, and different societies answer them differently. But what is clear is that as long as humans eat food, we will have strong opinions about it. And as long as we have strong opinions, some of those opinions will become laws. Whether those laws make sense or not is almost beside the point. They exist as monuments to the fact that we care deeply about what goes in our mouths and how it gets there. And speaking of things we care deeply about, let us talk about marriage. Because if you think governments are intrusive about food, wait until you see how involved they have gotten in people's love lives. Throughout history, lawmakers have decided that your choice of spouse, your decision to marry or not marry, and even remembering your wedding anniversary are all matters of state interest. We are about to explore marriage laws so invasive, so bizarre, and so controlling that they make pickle bounce test look reasonable. From ancient Rome forcing people to get married or face penalties, to modern-day Samoa where forgetting your wife's birthday could land you in jail, the intersection of law and love has produced some truly unforgettable regulations. Let us see what happens when the government decides your romantic life is their business. Love is supposed to be about choice, right? Two people meet, fall in love, decide to build a life together. It is one of the most personal decisions anyone can make. But throughout history, governments have looked at marriage and thought, actually, this is our business too. And not just regulating the legal aspects like property rights and inheritance, though they certainly did that. I am talking about laws that literally penalized you for being single, that made it illegal to propose marriage under false pretenses, that could send you to prison for forgetting an anniversary. Tonight, we are exploring how societies have tried to control one of the most intimate parts of human life, who we love and how we commit to them. Let me take you back to ancient Rome in the year 9 in the Common Era. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was worried, not about barbarian invasions or economic collapse or political rivals, though he worried about those too. No, Augustus was specifically worried about birth rates among the Roman upper class. Wealthy Romans were getting married later, having fewer children, and some were choosing not to marry at all. Augustus saw this as an existential threat to Rome's future. So he did what any reasonable emperor would do. He made being single illegal. Well, not exactly illegal, but so financially punishing that you would desperately want to get married. The law was called the Lex Papia Poppaea, named after the two consuls who officially proposed it, though everyone knew it was Augustus pulling the strings. Here is how it worked. If you were a man between the ages of 25 and 60, or a woman between 20 and 50, you were expected to be married. Not just married, but actively producing children. If you remained unmarried, you faced severe penalties. You could not inherit property from anyone outside your immediate family. If someone left you money in their will, the state would take it. You were excluded from certain public events and positions. You were essentially made into a second-class citizen because you chose to stay single. But Augustus did not stop there. Even if you were married, if you did not have children, you still faced penalties. The law created a system called ius trium liberorum, which translates to the right of 3 children. If you had 3 or more children, you received privileges, tax breaks, priority in public office, exemption from certain obligations, but if you were married and childless, you were still penalized, though not as severely as the unmarried. Now imagine living under this system. You are a 28, 50-year-old Roman man who has not found the right person yet. Maybe you are focused on your career. Maybe you're dealing with family issues. Maybe you just have not met anyone you want to marry. Too bad. The state has decided that your personal timeline is a threat to society. You need to get married, and you need to do it now or face financial ruin. The law was so unpopular that even Augustus's own family struggled with it. The poet Propertius, writing during this period, complained bitterly about being pressured to marry when he preferred his bachelor lifestyle. The historian Tacitus, writing a century later, noted that the law had largely failed in its goal of increasing birth rates. Upper-class Romans found ways around it. They would marry briefly, divorce, remarry, all to maintain the appearance of compliance while avoiding the actual commitment of family life. And here is the darkest irony of the Lex Papia Poppaea. There were a group of women in Rome who were technically violating this law every single day and could do nothing about it. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, took a vow of chastity for 30 years. They were forbidden from marrying or having children. But the Lex Papia Poppaea required women to marry and have children. So these priestesses, some of the most respected women in Roman society, were technically criminals under Augustus's marriage law. The Romans recognized this absurdity and created an exemption for Vestal virgins. But think about what that means. The law was so rigid, so all-encompassing, that it accidentally criminalized some of the most important religious figures in Rome. That is what happens when governments try to force personal choices. The rules never quite fit reality, no matter how carefully you craft them. The Lex Papia Poppaea lasted for centuries, slowly being modified and weakened over time, until it was finally abolished in the 5th century. But for over 400 years, Romans lived under a system that penalized them for being single. 400 years of people getting married not because they wanted to, but because the state left them no other financial option. Can you imagine that today? What if tomorrow the government announced that anyone unmarried after age 25 would lose their inheritance rights and face higher taxes? There would be riots. And yet for Romans, this was just normal life. You adapted, you found ways around it, or you paid the price. Now let us jump forward about 2,000 years to South Carolina, where they had a very different kind of marriage law. In South Carolina there was a law on the books, and technically still is, that makes it illegal for a man to seduce a woman under the promise of marriage if he does not actually intend to marry her. This is called seduction under promise of marriage, and it was considered a crime against morality and decency. The law was created in the 1800s when women's reputations were fragile, precious things that could be destroyed by scandal. If a woman was known to have been intimate with a man before marriage, she was considered ruined, unmarriageable, socially dead. So men who wanted to take advantage of women would promise marriage, convince the woman to sleep with them, and then disappear, leaving the woman with the destroyed reputation and possibly pregnant. South Carolina said, "That is fraud, that is seduction through false promises, and we are going to make it illegal." The law specified that if a man promised to marry a woman with the deliberate intent to deceive her into intimacy, and then did not follow through on that promise, he could be prosecuted. The penalty included fines and even jail time. On the surface, this seems like a law designed to protect women, and in some ways it was. It gave women legal recourse against men who had deceived them. But it also reveals how much society controlled women's sexuality through the concept of honor and reputation. The law did not say women have the right to make their own sexual choices. It said, women's sexuality is so valuable and so fragile that we need special laws to protect it from deceitful men. And here is the complicated part. This law is still technically on the books in South Carolina, It has not been repealed. Now, would it be enforced today? Almost certainly not. Modern courts would struggle to prosecute this without violating all sorts of constitutional protections. How do you prove intent? How do you determine if someone genuinely meant to marry at the time they made the promise, but later changed their mind? The law is essentially unenforceable by modern standards, but the fact that it exists tells us something. South Carolina, like many places, has laws accumulated over centuries that reflect the values of different eras. This particular law comes from a time when women's sexual purity was considered a matter of legal protection, when promises of marriage were taken with deadly seriousness, when your word was considered legally binding even in intimate relationships. Would you want to live under that system, where every romantic conversation, every expression of future commitment could potentially become legal evidence? Where saying, "I love you and want to marry you someday," could be interpreted as a binding promise that if broken makes you a criminal? It sounds suffocating, yet for generations this was normal. Now, speaking of marriage laws that make you grateful for modern life, let me tell you about Samoa. In Samoa, there is reportedly a law that says if you forget your wife's birthday, you can be prosecuted. Yes, you read that correctly. Forgetting your spouse's birthday is potentially a legal offence. Now, I need to be honest with you. Tracking down the exact details of this law is difficult. Different sources report it slightly differently, and it is unclear whether this is an actual criminal statute or more of a customary law that carries social rather than legal penalties. But the fact that it is widely reported and discussed tells us something important. The idea resonates because it reflects genuine cultural values. In Samoan culture, family relationships are sacred. Respect for spouses, attention to family members, and maintaining harmony in relationships are not just nice ideas, they are fundamental social obligations. The concept of va fealoaloai, which means maintaining good relationships, is central to Samoan life. If forgetting your wife's birthday is indeed punishable, it is because doing so represents a failure of respect and attention that the community finds unacceptable. Think about what this means. In many Western societies, we view forgetting a birthday as rude, inconsiderate, maybe grounds for an argument or sleeping on the couch. But it is not illegal. It is a personal relationship problem, not a legal one. The government does not care if you forget your anniversary or your spouse's birthday. That is between you and your partner. But Samoa, at least according to these reports, has decided that maintaining respectful relationships is so important to social harmony that the community needs to enforce it. Your marriage is not just your business, it is everyone's business. Your behavior toward your spouse reflects on the community, affects social cohesion, and therefore can be subject to community judgment and potentially legal consequences. Is this oppressive? Or is it a beautiful expression of communal values where everyone is accountable to everyone else? I honestly do not know. It depends on your perspective. From an individualistic Western viewpoint, it seems like massive overreach. Your personal relationships should be private. But from a communal perspective, maybe it makes sense. Maybe society functions better when everyone is held accountable for treating their loved ones well. What would happen in your relationship if forgetting important dates was actually illegal? Would you be in trouble, or would you be safe because you never forget? It is an interesting thought experiment about where personal responsibility ends and social enforcement begins. Now let us travel back in time to the year 438 in the Common Era, to the Theodosian Code. This was a massive compilation of Roman laws created under Emperor Theodosius II. Among its many provisions, the Theodosian Code made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and prohibited the worship of any other gods. But more than that, it made changing your religion a crime punishable by death, If you were born Christian and converted to any other religion, Judaism, paganism, any of the mystery cults that still existed, you could be executed. Your property could be confiscated. Your family could be punished. The state had decided that your spiritual beliefs, your personal relationship with the divine, were matters of government control, but here is where it connects to marriage. The Theodosian Code also regulated who Christians could marry. Marriages between Christians and non-Christians were forbidden. If you were a Christian woman and fell in love with a Jewish man, you could not legally marry him. If you did anyway, the marriage was considered invalid, and both of you could face legal penalties. This created impossible situations. Imagine you are a Christian in 5th century Rome. You meet someone wonderful, kind, intelligent, someone you genuinely love, but they follow a different religious tradition. The state says you cannot be together. Your choice is to either abandon this person you love, convince them to convert to Christianity, which might violate their own deeply held beliefs, or break the law and risk everything. The Theodosian Code lasted for generations, shaping how people thought about marriage, religion, and personal choice. It established precedents that influenced European law for over 1,000 years. The idea that the state should control religious belief, that conversion away from Christianity was criminal, that interfaith marriage was forbidden, these concepts became embedded in Western legal tradition. We still see echoes of this today. Many countries have laws about interfaith marriage, usually less harsh than the Theodosian Code, but still restrictive. Some cultures strongly discourage or effectively ban marriages between people of different religious backgrounds. The government or community steps in and says, "Your love is not acceptable because you worship differently." How many love stories have been crushed by the laws like these? How many people have been forced to choose between their family, their culture, their legal status, and the person they love? The numbers are incalculable. Finally, let me take you back even further, to ancient Babylon around 1750 before Christ, to the Code of Hammurabi. Now this code is famous for an eye justice, but it also had laws about marriage and accusations, and one provision is particularly relevant to our discussion. The Code of Hammurabi stated that if you accused someone of a crime, you had to prove your accusation beyond doubt. If you could not prove it, you would face the same punishment the accused person would have faced if found guilty. So if you accused someone of murder and could not prove it, you would be executed for false accusation. This applied to marriage too. If you accused a woman of adultery, a crime that carried severe penalties including death, you had to prove it absolutely. If you could not, you faced consequences. The code was trying to prevent false accusations from destroying innocent people's lives. But here is the truly bizarre part. One of the methods for proving innocence in Babylonian law was trial by river ordeal. The accused person would be thrown into the river. If they survived, they were innocent. If they drowned, they were guilty. Yes, it is the same insane logic we saw in medieval Europe, but this is over 3,000 years earlier. Humans have been using this stupid test for millennia. So imagine this scenario in ancient Babylon. A man accuses his wife of adultery. She denies it. The court says, "Okay, we will throw her in the river. If she survives, she is innocent and you will be punished for the false accusation. If she drowns, she was guilty, but she is also dead, so congratulations, you were right, but you also just killed your wife." Nobody wins in this system. What all these marriage laws reveal is how much societies have tried to control the most personal aspects of human life. From Rome, forcing people to marry, to South Carolina punishing deceptive proposals, to Samoa potentially prosecuting birthday forgetters, to the Theodosian Code banning interfaith marriage, to Babylon's trial by drowning for adultery accusations, governments have consistently decided that your love life is their business. Why? Because marriage is not just about two people, it is about property, inheritance, social stability, birth rates, cultural continuity. When you get married, you are not just committing to another person, you're creating a new economic unit, a potential child-rearing situation, a link between families. Society has always had a stake in these relationships, which is why society as a whole will always try to regulate them. But where is the line? When does legitimate social interest become oppressive control? That is the question every society has to answer for itself. And judging by history, we have not been very good at finding the balance. The good news is that at least in many parts of the world, we have moved toward greater freedom in marriage. You generally cannot be penalized just for being single. Promising marriage is not a crime if you change your mind. Interfaith marriages are legal in most places. We have made progress, but we still have work to do. Many countries still ban same-sex marriage. Many cultures still enforce arranged marriages. Many legal systems still treat marriage as primarily an economic contract rather than a relationship between equals. The journey toward true freedom in love is ongoing. As we move forward in our exploration of history's strangest laws, keep this in mind. Every law about personal behavior, whether it is about marriage, food, clothing, or anything else, represents society's attempt to control individual choice. Sometimes that control is necessary for the common good. Sometimes it is oppressive overreach, and often it is both at the same time. But if governments have been intrusive about marriage during the week, you should see what they've done about Sundays. Throughout history, religious authorities and governments have joined forces to create laws specifically about the Sabbath day. What you can do, what you cannot do, where you can go, what you can buy. And these laws get wonderfully absurdly specific. Can you ride a carousel? Can you wear a fake moustache? Can you whisper? Believe it or not, all of these have been regulated by Sunday laws. Let us explore how one day of the week became one of the most heavily legislated periods in human history. Sundays are supposed to be restful, right? A day of peace, reflection, maybe sleeping in or spending time with family. But throughout history, governments and religious authorities have looked at Sunday and seen an opportunity. An opportunity to control exactly how you rest, what you do for fun, and even what facial accessories you're allowed to wear in church. Yes, you heard that right. Facial accessories. We are about to explore a world where one day of the week became the most regulated, most controlled, most legislated 24 hours in human history. And the truly bizarre part? Many of these laws are still technically enforceable today. Let us start in Idaho, because Idaho has a law so specific, so wonderfully absurd, that it sounds like it was made up as a joke. In 1907, the state of Idaho passed a law making it illegal to ride a merry-go-round on Sundays. Not roller coasters, not Ferris wheels, just merry-go-rounds, carousels. Those beautiful rotating platforms with painted horses and cheerful music. On Sundays, illegal. Now, why would Idaho lawmakers wake up one morning and think, you know what is destroying the moral fabric of our society? Children riding carousel horses on the Lord's Day. To understand this, we need to talk about blue laws. Blue laws were regulations created primarily in the United States and England to restrict activities on Sundays in accordance with Christian values. The name supposedly comes from the blue paper they were printed on, though historians debate this origin. Blue laws were everywhere in early 20th century America. They banned shopping, working, drinking alcohol, tending theatres, playing sports, and yes, even innocent amusements like riding merry-go-rounds. The logic was that Sunday should be devoted entirely to worship, rest, and religious contemplation. Anything that distracted from that, anything that was too fun, too commercial, too worldly was prohibited. Idaho's merry-go-round law was part of this broader movement. In 1907, Idaho was still a young state admitted to the Union only 17 years earlier. Religious communities, particularly Protestant denominations, had significant influence over local government, and they were concerned about what they saw as the secularization of Sunday. Amusement parks were becoming popular. Carnivals would come through towns, and children, instead of sitting quietly in church or at home, wanted to ride the carousel, so Idaho banned it. Not permanently, just on Sundays. 6 days a week, ride all you want, but on Sunday, that merry-go-round better be still and silent, or someone is breaking the law. The penalty was typically a fine, though in extreme cases of repeated violation, you could face a brief jail sentence. Can you imagine being a child in 1907 Idaho? You wake up excited because the carnival is in town, you run to your parents and beg to go to the fair, and they say, "Not today, honey, it is Sunday. Riding the carousel is illegal today, we can go Monday." The disappointment would be crushing. And all because adults decided that joy and worship could not coexist on the same day. The truly ridiculous part is that this law was never officially repealed. Technically, right now, if you are in Idaho on a Sunday and you get on a carousel, you're violating a state statute that is over 100 years old. Now, would anyone actually enforce it? Almost certainly not. Idaho has bigger concerns than carousel riding criminals, but the law sits there in the legal code, a fossil from an era when government felt entitled to regulate your Sunday afternoon amusement. Now, speaking of what you cannot do in church, let us travel to Alabama. Alabama has a law that is so wonderfully specific in its absurdity that I need you to fully appreciate every detail. In Alabama, it is illegal to wear a fake mustache in church if doing so causes laughter that disrupts the service. Let me unpack this. First, fake mustaches are fine outside of church. Wear all the fake facial hair you want in public, at home, at work, no problem. Second, you can wear a fake mustache to church as long as it does not cause laughter. If you have a really convincing fake mustache and nobody notices, you are technically legal. But if your fake mustache is ridiculous enough that people start laughing, and that laughter disrupts the church service, then you have crossed into criminal territory. This law dates back to the late 1800s and early 1900s when vaudeville comedy was incredibly popular. Comedians would use fake mustaches, wigs, and other disguises as part of their acts. Apparently, some young men thought it would be hilarious to wear these comedy props to church as pranks. They would show up to Sunday service with absurd fake mustaches, sit in the pews, and wait for people to notice. When the congregation started laughing during prayers or hymns, it would disrupt the entire service. Church leaders were not amused. They complained to local authorities that their services were being turned into comedy shows, and Alabama legislators, taking these concerns seriously, passed a law making it illegal to wear any imitation facial feature that causes disruption in a place of worship. The law was specifically about maintaining decorum and respect in religious spaces. But think about the enforcement problems here. Who determines if laughter is disruptive? If 3 people chuckle quietly, is that illegal? If the entire congregation erupts in uncontrollable laughter, definitely illegal, but what is the threshold? And how do you prove intent? What if you just wanted to hide your lack of a real mustache and it happened to look funny? What if you are wearing a fake mustache for a legitimate theatrical performance that happens to be in a church? The law creates all these impossible judgment calls, but it exists. And technically, if you show up to an Alabama church with a comedically oversized fake mustache and people start laughing during the sermon, you could be cited for violating this statute. I would love to see that court case. Your Honor, the defendant knowingly wore a mustache of an excessively comic nature, causing Sister Margaret to laugh during the Lord's Prayer. But Alabama was not alone in creating oddly specific church behavior laws. Delaware had their own contribution to religious regulation. In the town of Lewis, Delaware, it is illegal to whisper in church. Not talk loudly. That makes sense to prohibit. Not shout or cause a disturbance. Whisper. Those quiet, barely audible conversations that people have during services when they need to communicate something quickly without disturbing everyone. The law was created because apparently excessive whispering during services had become a problem. People would whisper to each other throughout the entire service, gossiping, making plans, commenting on the sermon, and the collective noise of all that whispering was actually quite loud and distracting. So Lewis said, "Fine, no whispering. If you need to communicate during church, write a note or wait until after." This law reveals something interesting about how communities tried to enforce respectful behavior in religious spaces. They could not just say be respectful because that is too vague. So they had to get specific. No fake mustaches, no whispering, no riding carousels before church. Each law was a response to a specific behavior that someone found problematic. But here is what I find fascinating. All of these laws assume that external behavior determines internal reverence. They assume that if everyone sits quietly, looks serious, and refrains from wearing comedy props, then the religious experience will be meaningful. But is that true? Can you legislate spirituality? Can you force someone to have a genuine religious experience by controlling their clothing and behavior? History suggests you cannot. Despite centuries of blue laws and religious regulations, church attendance has been declining in many Western countries for decades. Turns out that making something mandatory or heavily regulated does not make it meaningful. If anything, it might have the opposite effect. When religion becomes associated with joyless restriction, when you cannot ride a carousel, cannot laugh, cannot whisper, it stops feeling like a spiritual practice and starts feeling like punishment. Now, let us talk about one of the most famous myths surrounding Sunday laws, the supposed mince pie ban in England. You've probably heard this story. During the Puritan era in 1600s, England, Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan government supposedly banned Christmas celebrations, including the eating of mince pies, as part of their campaign against excessive festivity. Here is the truth. Cromwell's government did try to reduce Christmas celebrations. They thought Christmas had become too commercial and indulgent, too focused on feasting and drinking and not enough on religious devotion. There were proposals to ban certain Christmas activities, but the mince pie ban specifically never actually became law. What did happen was that in 1656, Parliament debated regulations about Christmas observance. Some Puritans argued that elaborate Christmas feasts, including traditional foods like mince pies, were inappropriate displays of excess, but the law they eventually passed focused on keeping shops and markets closed on Christmas Day and prohibiting theatrical performances. Mince pies were discussed but never formally banned. So why does everyone think they were banned? Because the myth is better than the reality. The idea of strict Puritans banning something as innocent and delicious as mince pie perfectly captures how we view that era: joyless, controlling, opposed pleasure. The story spread, got repeated in books and articles, and became accepted as fact even though it was not. But here is what is real and still on the books today: England's law against wearing armour in Parliament. Dating back to 1313, introduced by King Edward II, this law prohibits anyone from wearing a suit of armour inside the Houses of Parliament. The law still exists. If you somehow got into Parliament wearing chainmail today, you would be violating a 700-year-old statute. Why does this matter for our discussion of Sunday laws? Because it shows how religious and political authority were intertwined. Parliament was not just a government building. It was a space where oaths were sworn and where God was invoked, where religious and civil law intersected. Controlling behaviour in Parliament meant controlling behaviour in a semi-sacred space. Now let me tell you about Arkansas and a law that is not quite about religion, but reveals similar impulses about cultural control. In Arkansas, there is an actual law about how you must pronounce the state's name. The correct pronunciation is Arkansas with the final S silent. If you pronounce it Arkansas, you're technically violating state law. The law was passed in 1981, making it surprisingly recent. Arkansas legislators were tired of people mispronouncing their state's name, especially in national media. The name comes from a French interpretation of a Native American word, and the proper pronunciation reflects that French heritage. So they made it official. The name is Arkansas, and that is how it shall be spoken. Is this enforceable? Absolutely not. Can you imagine being arrested for mispronouncing a state name? But the law exists as a statement of cultural identity. Arkansas was saying, this is who we are, this is our heritage. You will acknowledge it correctly. It is the same impulse behind Sunday laws and religious regulations. Communities trying to enforce their values, their traditions, their sense of what is proper and right. Sometimes through religious doctrine, sometimes through cultural pride, but always through the mechanism of law. What all of these Sunday laws reveal is how much societies have tried to use legal force to maintain religious observance. And for a long time it worked, sort of. In early 20th century America, most businesses were closed on Sunday. Most people went to church. Sunday was genuinely different from other days. But as society became more diverse, more secular, and more individualistic, these laws became impossible to enforce. How do you make people be reverent? How do you legislate spirituality? You cannot. And slowly most blue laws were repealed or simply stopped being enforced. However, some remain. Many states still have laws restricting alcohol sales on Sundays, though these are slowly disappearing. Some places still ban certain types of businesses from opening on Sundays. And those weird specific laws, the carousel ban, the mustache prohibition, the whispering restriction, they are still in the legal code. Forgotten but not gone. Here is my question for you. Do you think government should regulate religious observance at all? Is it ever appropriate to say this day is sacred and here are the rules you must follow? Or should religious practice be entirely voluntary with no legal enforcement whatsoever? Different cultures answer this differently. Some countries still have strict religious laws that affect daily life. Others have moved toward complete separation of church and state. The United States is somewhere in the middle, officially secular, but with lingering religious influences in law. What is clear is that as societies become more pluralistic, these single religion laws become harder to justify. In a community where everyone is Christian and agrees on how Sunday should be observed, maybe a carousel ban made sense to them. But in modern diverse societies, who decides what is sacred? Who determines how a holy day should be spent? These are not easy questions, but history shows us that trying to force religious observance through law rarely works long term. It might create outward compliance, but it does not create genuine faith or meaningful spiritual experience. And it often breeds resentment, especially among those who do not share the dominant religion's views. The Blue Laws era is mostly behind us now, but it is worth remembering, because it shows how recently governments felt entitled to control not just your actions, but your leisure time, your spiritual practices, and apparently your facial hair choices in church. As we continue our journey through history's strangest laws, remember this. Every law about religion or Sunday observance represents someone's attempt to make the whole community follow their spiritual values. Sometimes those values were widely shared. Sometimes they were imposed by a powerful minority. But either way, they show that the line between personal faith and public policy has always been contested, messy, and occasionally ridiculous. But if religious regulations seem intrusive, Wait until you see what governments have decided about property rights, because the next chapter of our story explores laws about ownership that are so bizarre, you will question whether anyone has ever truly owned anything. From wives becoming property after a year of marriage, to royal fish that you cannot keep even if you catch them, to furniture that is illegal to put in your own yard, property law has produced some truly mind-bending regulations, and some of them determine who owns what based on the strangest criteria you can imagine. Let us dive into the world where possession, ownership, and the law collide in spectacular fashion. Ownership seems simple, right? You buy something, it is yours. You inherit something, it belongs to you. But throughout history, the concept of property has been twisted, stretched, and bent into shapes that would make your head spin. We are about to explore a legal landscape where holding onto something long enough can make it yours even if you stole it, where certain fish belong to the queen even if you caught them, where your own furniture becomes illegal based on where you put it, and where using someone's wheelchair as a poker chip could land you in serious trouble. Property law has produced some of the most bizarre, counterintuitive regulations in human history, and the question we keep coming back to is this: what does it really mean to own something? Let me take you back to ancient Rome, because the Romans had a concept of property that will fundamentally challenge how you think about ownership. It was called usua capio, which roughly translates to acquisition through use. The basic principle was deceptively simple. If you possessed something for long enough and treated it as your own, it legally became yours. Even if you originally took it without permission, even if it belonged to someone else. Time plus possession equals ownership. Here is how it worked in practice. Let us say you found a valuable statue sitting on the side of the road. Maybe it fell off a cart. Maybe someone abandoned it. Maybe someone lost it. You do not know, and honestly, under usua capio, you do not need to care. You take the statue home, you put it in your garden, you treat it as yours, and if the original owner does not show up and reclaim it within a certain time period, typically 1 or 2 years for movable property, congratulations, it is now legally yours. The law has transferred ownership from the person who lost it to you simply because you held on to it long enough. Now, this might sound insane to modern ears. How can possession for a set time period override legitimate ownership? But the Romans had their reasons. First, they wanted to encourage productive use of property. If you own something but you are not using it, not maintaining it, maybe you do not deserve to keep it. Second, they wanted legal clarity. If property ownership was constantly in dispute, with people claiming things based on ancient chains of ownership, nothing would ever be settled. Usua capio put a time limit on claims. After a certain point, the matter was closed. But here is where it gets truly wild. Usua capio did not just apply to objects, it applied to land. If you started farming someone else's land, and they did not stop you within the legal time period, that land became yours. You could literally steal property through patience and use. The original owner had to actively assert their rights, or they would lose them. Think about what this incentivized. It encouraged squatting, for one thing. If you found a piece of unused land and started cultivating it, you just needed to hold out long enough and it would become legally yours. It also encouraged landowners to be vigilant. You could not just own land and ignore it. You had to actively use it, visit it, make sure nobody else was claiming it through use. And yes, as we mentioned earlier, this principle even applied to wives in early Roman law. But beyond that disturbing application, usua capio shaped how Romans thought about property in general. Ownership was not a permanent, unassailable right. It was a relationship that required ongoing assertion and use. If you stopped using something, stopped caring for it, someone else could step in and claim it. Modern property law still has echoes of this concept. We call it adverse possession or prescription, depending on the jurisdiction. If someone uses your land openly, continuously, and without your permission for a certain number of years, often 15 to 20, they can legally claim it as theirs. This is how property disputes get resolved when ownership records are unclear or missing. But here is my question for you. Is this fair? Imagine you own a piece of land in a remote area. You do not visit it often, maybe once every few years. Someone starts using it, builds a structure on it, farms it. You do not notice because you're not there. 20 years pass, and suddenly they can claim legal ownership. You've lost your property not because you sold it or gave it away, but simply because you are not paying attention. Does that seem just, or does it seem like legalized theft? The law says it is just because you had every opportunity to assert your rights and you failed to do so. But it certainly feels wrong to lose something you legitimately own simply through inattention. Yet this is how property law works in many places, even today. Possession over time can trump original ownership. Now let us travel to medieval England, where King Edward II decided that certain animals were so valuable, so special, that only royalty deserved them. In 1324, Edward passed a law declaring that all whales, sturgeons, dolphins and porpoises caught within 5 kilometres of the English coast were royal fish and belonged to the crown. This was pure greed disguised as royal privilege. These creatures were incredibly valuable. Whale meat was prized, and whale oil was essential for lighting lamps. Sturgeon was considered a delicacy, the ultimate luxury food served at royal banquet. These were not just fish, they were swimming treasure chests, and Edward wanted all of them. The law stated that any fisherman who caught one of these royal fish had to immediately report it to the crown. The king would then decide what to do with it. Sometimes the king would buy it from the fisherman at a price the king determined, which was always less than market value. Sometimes the king would just take it and offer a small reward. Either way, the fisherman who did all the work of catching this creature did not get to keep it or sell it at full value. And here is the truly remarkable part. This law is still on the books in the United Kingdom today. It has never been repealed. Technically, right now, if you are fishing in British waters and you catch a sturgeon, it belongs to Queen Elizabeth, or rather, now King Charles III. You are legally required to offer it to the monarch. In 2004, this law made headlines when a fisherman named Robert Davies caught a 10-foot sturgeon off the coast of Wales. He knew about the royal fish law, so he contacted Buckingham Palace to ask Queen Elizabeth if she wanted it. The palace politely declined, saying the Queen appreciated the offer, but he could keep or sell the fish himself. But the fact that he had to ask, that is the law in action. Can you imagine? You spend hours fighting to reel in a massive sturgeon, one of the most valuable catches possible, and your first phone call has to be to the royal family to see if they want it. It is medieval privilege preserved in modern legal code. The monarch probably gets dozens of these offers a year and turns them all down, but the requirement remains. Why has this law never been repealed? Partly because it is harmless. The royals do not actually confiscate fish anymore, but also because it is a quirky historical artifact that people find charming. It is one of those weird laws that gets trotted out in articles like Strange but True British Laws, and it gives the monarchy a bit of eccentric character, so it stays. But it raises an interesting question about property rights. If you catch something in public waters, who does it belong to? In most cases, you. But apparently if that thing is rare and valuable enough, the state can claim it. This principle extends to other areas too. Many countries have laws saying that if you find archaeological artifacts, historical treasures, or certain minerals on your land, they belong to the government, not you. Your property rights extend only so far, and then the state steps in. Now, let us head to Rhode Island, where they have oddly specific laws about poultry. According to Rhode Island General Laws, Title 11, Chapter 41, Section 9, if you steal poultry, chickens, ducks, geese, from any building or enclosure where they are kept, you can face up to 1 year in prison or a fine of up to $500, or both. Now you might think, okay, theft is theft. Why is poultry special? But Rhode Island made poultry theft its own specific crime with its own specific penalties. This is separate from general theft laws, and the law goes further. If you receive poultry knowing it was stolen, you face the same penalties. So if your neighbour shows up with a stolen chicken and you accept it, you are equally guilty. Why did Rhode Island need a specific law about stolen chickens? Because historically poultry theft was incredibly common and incredibly damaging to farmers. Chickens were valuable. They provided eggs, meat, and could be bred for more chickens. Stealing someone's chickens could devastate their livelihood. But because chickens were relatively small and easy to hide, they were frequently stolen. General theft laws often set penalties based on the value of the stolen item. A chicken might not be worth enough to trigger serious penalties. So Rhode Island, like many agricultural states, created specific poultry protection laws with penalties harsh enough to deter thieves. They were saying, we do not care if a chicken only costs $20. Steal it and you are going to prison. The law also includes a fascinating provision. Half of any fine collected goes to the person who filed the complaint. So if you catch someone stealing your chickens, you report them, they get fined $500, and you receive $250. It is a built-in incentive for victims to report poultry theft and pursue prosecution. The law is essentially deputizing chicken owners as enforcers of poultry property rights. Is this law still enforced? Occasionally, yes. Rhode Island still has farms, and chicken theft still happens. In 2015, a man in Rhode Island was actually prosecuted under this law for stealing chickens from a local farm. So this is not just a historical curiosity, it is active legal code that people still violate and get punished for. But let us move to Delaware, where property law takes a truly bizarre turn. In Delaware, it is illegal to use prosthetic limbs or wheelchairs as collateral in any wager or game of chance. Yes, you read that correctly. If you are playing poker and you run out of chips, you cannot bet your prosthetic leg. If you're gambling and desperate, you cannot put up your wheelchair as a wager. It is specifically, explicitly illegal. This law exists because apparently, at some point in Delaware's history, people were doing exactly this. They were gambling away their medical devices, their mobility aids, the very tools they needed to function in daily life. And Delaware lawmakers said, this has to stop. We are going to make it illegal. The law includes both prosthetic limbs and wheelchairs specifically, which suggests that both types of items were being wagered with some regularity. Imagine the scene in a gambling hall. Someone has lost all their money, lost their jewellery, lost everything of value. And in desperation they say, fine, I will bet my prosthetic arm. Bet one more hand. And the other gamblers apparently accepted these bets often enough that the state felt compelled to intervene. This law reveals something dark about gambling addiction. When people are in the grip of compulsive gambling, they will wager anything. They will risk things they absolutely need for survival. Delaware recognized that some property is so essential to basic human dignity and function that it should be legally protected from being gambled away. The law also applied to debt collection. The original statute specified that prosthetic limbs and wheelchairs could not be seized to satisfy debts. You could owe someone money, refuse to pay, and they could take you to court and potentially seize your property. But they could not take your prosthetic leg or your wheelchair. Those items were declared legally untouchable. This was expanded from even older laws about what could not be seized from debtors. Historically, many places had laws protecting tools of your trade. If you were a blacksmith, creditors could not seize your hammer and anvil, because without those tools, you could never earn money to pay your debts. Delaware extended this logic to mobility devices. If someone is in a wheelchair, taking that wheelchair does not help anyone. It just destroys that person's ability to function. It is actually a humane law disguised as a bizarre one. Yes, it is weird that it had to be specified, but the underlying principle is beautiful. Some things are more important than debt, more important than gambling, more important than property rights. Basic human mobility and function are not up for negotiation. Finally, let us end in Colorado, where they have a law so mundane sounding, yet so strictly enforced that it trips up people all the time. In Colorado, it is illegal to keep, use, or store upholstered furniture outdoors unless that furniture was specifically manufactured for outdoor use. This means if you have a regular indoor couch and you put it on your front porch or in your backyard, you're breaking the law. Indoor chairs on your lawn? Illegal. A mattress in your yard? Definitely illegal. Only furniture specifically designed and manufactured for outdoor use can be outside. Why would Colorado care where you put your couch? For several reasons, actually. First, abandoned furniture becomes a breeding ground for pests. Rats, mice, insects. They love burrowing into old couches left outside. Second, furniture left outdoors deteriorates quickly, becoming an eyesore that affects neighborhood property values. Third, rainwater collects in upholstered furniture, creating stagnant pools that breed mosquitoes. But the most common violation involves people trying to sell furniture. You have an old couch you want to get rid of, so you put it in your front yard with a for sale sign. Seems reasonable, right? But in Colorado, unless you have a permit for a yard sale, and the furniture is only temporarily outside for the sale, you're violating the outdoor furniture law. Denver specifically has cracked down on this. Code enforcement officers patrol neighborhoods looking for couches on porches, chairs in yards, mattresses anywhere outside. If they see a violation, they leave a notice. If you do not move the furniture within a certain time frame, you get fined. The fines can be substantial, hundreds of dollars for repeat violations. Some people have fought these laws, arguing that it is their property and they should be able to put their furniture wherever they want on their own land. But courts have consistently upheld the regulations, saying that cities have legitimate interests in maintaining neighborhood aesthetics, preventing pest infestations, and ensuring public health. What is interesting is that this law distinguishes between furniture based on its original intent, an outdoor-rated couch made of weather-resistant materials, perfectly legal outside, the exact same couch but manufactured for indoor use, illegal outside. It is the same physical object, but the legal status changes based on how it was manufactured and labelled. That is property law for you! Sometimes the object itself matters less than the category it fits into. So what do all these property laws teach us? First, that ownership is never absolute. Every society places limits on what you can do with your property. You cannot gamble away your wheelchair. You cannot keep royal fish. You cannot put your indoor couch outside. Property rights are always balanced against community interests, historical privileges, and public health concerns. Second, these laws reveal what societies value. Rhode Island values agricultural livelihoods, so they protect chickens with harsh penalties. Delaware values human dignity, so they protect mobility devices from being wagered. Colorado values neighborhood aesthetics and public health, so they regulate furniture placement. Every weird property law tells you something about what that community considers important. Third, the concept of acquisition through use, whether Roman usua capio or modern adverse possession, challenges our assumptions about ownership. Is ownership about having a deed, or is it about actually using and caring for something? If you own land but abandon it and someone else makes it productive, Who has the better claim? These are not easy questions, and different legal systems answer them differently. As we move forward, I want you to think about this. What do you actually own? Really own, in the sense that nobody can take it from you, nobody can regulate its use, nobody can claim it through time or law? The answer is probably less than you think. We like to believe in absolute private property, but every piece of property you own exists within a web of laws, regulations, easements, and community standards. Your ownership is always conditional, always limited, always subject to someone else's claim or the state's interest. That is not necessarily bad. Some limitations protect us, but it is worth understanding that when you own something, you are really just holding it within a system of rules that determines what you can and cannot do with it. And those rules, as we have seen, can be bizarre, arbitrary, and sometimes downright weird. But if property laws within one nation can be strange, imagine what happens when nations themselves start legislating against each other. When historical grievances become legal mandates. When wars end, but the laws they inspired live on forever. Our next chapter explores how countries have used law as a weapon of cultural warfare, creating regulations born from old conflicts, ancient rivalries, and national pride wounded long ago. From Denmark's authorization to beat Swedes with sticks, to laws about commemorating failed terrorist plots, to mandatory celebrations of historical victories, we are about to see how nationalism gets encoded into legal code. And some of these laws are not just still on the books, they are still emotionally relevant to the people living under them. Let us explore what happens when law becomes a monument to historical grudges. History is full of wars. Nations have fought over territory, resources, religion, and honor. But what happens when the fighting stops and the grudge remains? Sometimes, instead of continued warfare, countries encode their resentment directly into law. They create regulations that serve no practical purpose except to say, "We still remember what you did to us, and we have not forgiven you." Tonight we are exploring the fascinating world of nationalist laws, regulations born from historical conflicts that transform old battles into ongoing legal warfare. Some of these laws are symbolic, some are hilariously petty, and some are still technically enforceable, waiting for the perfect moment when ancient rivalries resurface. Let me tell you a story about the winter of 1657, when Sweden invaded Denmark in the most unexpected way imaginable. The Dano-Swedish War had been raging, and King Charles X Gustav of Sweden wanted to attack Denmark. His military advisors told him he needed to wait for spring when the weather improved and they could transport troops across the Øresund Strait by boat. Charles agreed to wait. But then something extraordinary happened. In late January 1658, one of the coldest winters in recorded history hit Scandinavia. The Øresund Strait, the body of water separating Denmark and Sweden, froze completely solid. And Charles realized he did not need boats. He could simply march his entire army across the ice, so he did. 10,000 Swedish soldiers, along with horses, artillery, and supply wagons, walked across a frozen ocean and invaded Denmark. The Danes were completely unprepared. They were not expecting an attack until spring and certainly not expecting an entire army to appear by walking on water. Denmark panicked. They quickly negotiated the Treaty of Roskilde, which forced them to give up significant territory to Sweden. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in Danish history, and it was all because the water froze at exactly the wrong time. Denmark never forgot this, and so they passed a law that is technically still valid today, that says if you see a Swede walking across the frozen Øresund, you have the legal right to beat them with a stick. Yes, seriously. If Sweden ever tries to invade Denmark across the ice again, Danish citizens are legally authorised to defend their homeland with wooden clubs. Now, obviously, this law is symbolic. Nobody is actually going to beat Swedish tourists with sticks if they walk on the frozen strait during winter. The law exists as a monument to Danish national pride and historical memory. It says, "We remember what you did, we will never be caught off guard again, and we are officially legally prepared to respond." What I love about this law is how specific and situational it is. It does not say you can beat Swedes anytime, anywhere. Only if they are walking across the frozen Öresund. Only in that exact scenario of invasion. It's like Denmark created a law for a situation that has a 0.001% chance of ever happening again. But it makes them feel better to have it on the books. And here is the question I want you to think about. Is this law harmful? It is not actually enforced. It does not affect Swedish-Danish relations today, which are generally friendly. But it does keep alive a memory of conflict. Every time someone mentions this law, it reminds both nations of a war from 367 years ago. Is that healthy nationalism and historical awareness? Or is it perpetuating old grudges that should be forgotten? Now, let us cross the North Sea to England, where they have a law that is not just symbolic, it is actually enforced. Every year on November the 5th, England celebrates Guy Fawkes Night, also called Bonfire Night, and this is not optional. By law, English citizens are encouraged, though not strictly required, to commemorate the failed gunpowder plot of 1605. Here is what happened. King James I was Protestant. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and including the now famous Guy Fawkes, decided they wanted a Catholic monarch instead. So they hatched a plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, when the King, all the Lords and all the members of Parliament would be gathered in one place. They rented a cellar beneath Parliament, filled it with 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough explosive to level the entire building, and waited for the right moment. But someone talked. An anonymous letter warned a Catholic lord to stay away from Parliament that day. The authorities searched the building and found Guy Fawkes in the cellar, literally standing guard over the gunpowder with a fuse and matches in his pocket. He was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed along with his co-conspirators. King James was so relieved to have survived that he declared November the 5th a national day of thanksgiving. Parliament passed the Thanksgiving Act in 1606, requiring church services to commemorate the king's survival. And while that specific act was repealed in 1859, the tradition became so embedded in English culture that it continues today. Cities across England light bonfires, burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, and set off fireworks every November the 5th. But here is where it gets interesting. Until 1959, yes, 1959, barely 60 years ago, there was a law in England requiring families to attend a Church of England service on November the 5th to commemorate the failed plot. If you refused to attend, you could face legal penalties. The government was using religious services to enforce national identity and anti-Catholic sentiment. Even today, the British monarch cannot be Catholic, cannot marry a Catholic, and must swear to uphold Protestant succession. These laws exist because of the gunpowder plot and similar historical conflicts. England is still legally organised around religious divisions that are over 400 years old. Think about that. 400 years ago, some men tried to blow up Parliament. They failed. They were executed. And here we are in 2025, and England is still celebrating their failure every single year. Is this a charming historical tradition, or is it a weird form of national grudge-holding, where an entire country annually celebrates violence against Catholics who tried to commit violence against Protestants? Now, let us head to France, where they had a law about fashion that reveals how clothing became tied to national identity. In 1571, France passed a law requiring all men to wear a flat cap, a simple cloth cap, nothing fancy, on Sundays and holidays. This was not about fashion police or social class distinctions. This was economic warfare. At the time, England was a major exporter of wool cloth, and the flat cap industry was significant to the English economy. France, always in competition with England, wanted to boost their own textile industry, so King Charles IX decided to mandate flat cap wearing. If every French man had to wear a flat cap on Sundays, that would create massive demand for caps, which would employ French hat makers, which would boost the French textile industry. The law was remarkably specific. It specified the type of cap, when it must be worn, and penalties for non-compliance. Men who showed up to church or public gatherings without their flat caps could be fined. It was nationalism through mandatory accessorizing. France was essentially saying, we will build our economy by legally requiring our citizens to buy hats. Did it work? Somewhat. French hat makers definitely saw increased business, but the law was deeply unpopular. Men did not like being told what to wear, especially when it was obviously a political and economic mandate rather than a genuine religious or cultural tradition. The law was eventually repealed, but it lasted for decades, during which time millions of French men wore flat caps not because they wanted to, but because the law said they had to. This is nationalism at its most petty and most practical. France and England were not at war during this period. They were engaged in economic competition, and France used law as a weapon in that competition, turning their own citizens' heads into mandatory advertising for French textile production. But if you think required hats are strange, let me tell you about Milan, Italy, where they had a law requiring you to smile. During the Austro-Hungarian Empire's rule over northern Italy in the 1800s, Milan was under Austrian control, and the Austrians, being the organised, regulation-loving people they were, introduced a citywide ordinance requiring citizens to smile in public. The law was supposedly based on a suggestion by a civic planner named Luigi Fabio, who argued that public happiness created better social order. But the real motivation was control. The Austrians wanted Milanese citizens to appear content under Austrian rule. Unhappy faces suggested discontent, which suggested potential rebellion. So they made happiness mandatory. The law included specific exemptions. You did not have to smile if you were attending a funeral. You did not have to smile if you were visiting someone in the hospital or caring for sick family members. In these situations, sadness was permitted. But in normal daily life, walking down the street, shopping at the markets, going about your business, you were expected to have a pleasant expression on your face. If you look too miserable, you could be fined. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this? You wake up in a bad mood. Maybe you got terrible news. Maybe you're worried about money or dealing with personal problems. But you step outside and you have to paste on a smile, because looking sad is literally illegal. It is forced emotional performance as civic duty. The law was never officially repealed. Technically, it still exists in Milan's old legal code, though it has not been enforced in over a century, but it represents something disturbing about how empires controlled occupied populations. It was not enough to control actions, they wanted to control expressions, emotions, the very appearance of contentment. Italian resistance to Austrian rule often took the form of exaggerated compliance with this law. People would smile so widely, so artificially that it became obvious satire. They were technically following the law while making it clear they were miserable. It was passive resistance through performance of forced happiness. Now, let us travel to Scotland, where they have one of my favourite weird laws, and this one is actually based on genuine hospitality tradition. In Scotland, if someone knocks on your door and asks to use your bathroom, you are legally required to let them in. Yes, really, you cannot deny someone access to your toilet. This law supposedly derives from ancient Scottish common law regarding hospitality and the rights of travellers. In the harsh Scottish climate, especially in rural areas, denying someone shelter or basic facilities could be genuinely dangerous. So Scottish tradition held that if someone was in need, whether for warmth, food, water, or yes, bathroom access, you had an obligation to help them. The bathroom-specific aspect became more formalised over time, though legal scholars debate whether this is actual statute law or just strong customary practice. Either way, it is widely believed in Scotland that you must allow someone to use your toilet if they ask, and refusing could theoretically get you in legal trouble. Practically speaking, how would this be enforced? If you refuse and the person reports you, would police actually investigate? Probably not, but the law or strong custom creates a social expectation of hospitality. It says that your property rights do not extend to denying someone basic human dignity and biological necessity. Now imagine you are a homeowner in Edinburgh. It is 10 at night. Someone knocks on your door and says, "I really need to use your bathroom. Do you let them in?" The law says you should. But modern safety concerns, stranger danger, and simple privacy might make you hesitate. This is where ancient customs of hospitality clash with modern urban anonymity. What I find beautiful about this law is the underlying principle. It says that community obligation trumps individual privacy in matters of basic human need. Your home is yours, but not so much yours that you can deny someone access to a toilet. It is collectivist thinking, embedded in legal tradition. Now, I want to ask you something. Do these nationalist laws serve any good purpose? Denmark's stick-beating authorization, England's Guy Fawkes commemorations, France's flat cap requirement, Milan's mandatory smiling, Scotland's bathroom hospitality, they all encode historical moments or cultural values into law. But should they? On one hand, these laws create continuity with the past. They remind us where we came from, what our ancestors experienced, what shaped our national character. They are living history kept alive through legal code rather than just textbooks. On the other hand, they can perpetuate division. The Denmark-Sweden law keeps alive a conflict from 1658. The Guy Fawkes celebrations continue to define England partly through opposition to Catholicism. These laws do not just remember history, they keep historical grievances active and relevant. And some of these laws reveal uncomfortable truths about nationalism. The Milan Smiling Law shows how authoritarian governments control not just behaviour but emotional expression. The French flat cap law shows how governments use their own citizens as pawns in economic warfare. These are not feel-good stories about charming traditions, they are examples of state power imposing itself on individual lives in the name of national interest. But here is what fascinates me most. These laws persist because removing them requires effort, and most of them are harmless enough that nobody bothers. Denmark is not actually encouraging violence against Swedes. Milan is not fining sad people. These laws exist in a strange liminal space where they are technically valid but practically defunct. They are legal fossils preserved in the codebook but extinct in practice. Yet they still matter, because they shape how nations see themselves. England's identity is partly built on resisting Catholic plots. Denmark's identity includes remembering Swedish invasion. These laws are not just regulations, they are stories that nations tell themselves about who they are and who they have been. So what do we learn from nationalist laws? First, that nations have long memories and those memories get encoded into legal systems. Second, that law is not just about practical governance, it is also about identity, culture, and collective memory. And third, that sometimes the most revealing laws are not the ones being enforced, but the ones that remain on the books as monuments to old battles and ancient pride. As we close this chapter on how nations use law to fight historical battles, I want you to reflect on this. What laws exist in your country that are really about historical memory rather than current necessity? What regulations preserve old conflicts or outdated values? And should we keep them for continuity or remove them to move forward? Because here is the thing. We are living in an era creating laws right now that future generations will look back on and think are completely absurd. Just like we find it ridiculous that Denmark authorizes stick beating or Milan mandated smiling, people in 2025 will look at our current laws and wonder what we were thinking. We are not done making weird laws, we are just getting started. And our next section proves exactly that. Because if you think historical laws are bizarre, wait until you see what legislators have been passing in the last few decades. From chewing gum bans to silly string regulations to laws about importing skunks, the modern world has shown that we have learned absolutely nothing from history's mistakes. We are still creating laws just as absurd as anything ancient Rome or medieval Europe ever dreamed up. Let us see what weird laws we are leaving for our grandchildren to laugh at. You would think that by now, after thousands of years of human civilization, after witnessing the absurdity of ancient codes and medieval madness, we would have figured out how to make reasonable laws. You would think modern legislators, with access to data, historical precedent, and democratic feedback, would avoid creating the same bizarre regulations that made Draco and medieval Europe look foolish. But you would be wrong. Dead wrong. Because right now, in our modern world, countries are passing and enforcing laws that are just as ridiculous as anything we have covered tonight. The only difference is that we cannot blame these on ancient superstition or medieval ignorance. These are our laws, created by us, in living memory. And that might be the most embarrassing part. Let me take you to Singapore, one of the most modern, efficient, technologically advanced cities in the world. Singapore has incredible infrastructure, world-class education, and some of the strictest laws on the planet. And among those laws is one that has become internationally famous, the chewing gum ban. In Singapore, it is illegal to import, sell, or manufacture chewing gum. If you are caught selling gum, you can face fines up to 100,000 Singapore dollars. That is about 73,000 United States dollars, and up to 2 years in prison. This is not an ancient law. This was passed in 1992. Yes, 1992. The same year that the internet was becoming publicly available, that the European Union was formed, that humanity was launching the Hubble Space Telescope. And Singapore was banning chewing gum. Why? The official reason was maintenance of public spaces. Singaporean authorities were frustrated by gum being stuck on subway doors, on elevator buttons, in mailbox slots, on sidewalks. The mass rapid transit system, Singapore's subway, was having serious problems with gum jamming the automatic doors, causing delays and costing money to clean. The government calculated that they were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars annually just removing discarded gum from public spaces. So they did what Singapore does best. They solved the problem with law enforcement. Not just a fine for littering, not just public education campaigns. They banned the substance entirely. No gum allowed. Problem solved. But here is where it gets interesting. The law was so strict that even possessing chewing gum could get you in trouble. If you brought gum into Singapore from another country, technically you were importing it, which was illegal. There are stories of tourists being questioned at the border about gum in their luggage. Immigration officers would confiscate packs of gum from travellers' bags. The international response was swift and mocking. Media around the world ran stories about Singapore's gum ban, portraying it as authoritarian overreach and ridiculous micromanagement. How could a modern democracy ban chewing gum? What is next? Banning whistling, outlawing smiling in the wrong way. But Singapore did not back down. They maintained the ban through decades of criticism. And here is what is remarkable. It worked. Singapore's public spaces are incredibly clean. The subway system runs flawlessly. There is no gum on the sidewalks, no gum on the seats, no gum causing problems. The law achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. However, in 2004, Singapore made a small concession. After pressure from the United States during free trade agreement negotiations, Singapore agreed to allow therapeutic gum prescribed by dentists or doctors for oral health, to be sold, but only by licensed pharmacists and only with documentation of medical necessity. So if you need nicotine gum to quit smoking, you can get it in Singapore. But you will need a prescription, and the pharmacy will record your name and identification. They are tracking therapeutic gum purchases. Now I want you to think about this. Is the Singapore gum ban stupid? Or is it actually brilliant? It is a law that looks absurd from the outside but makes perfect sense within Singapore's specific context and values. Singapore prioritizes collective cleanliness and efficiency over individual freedom to chew gum. They decided that the cost of allowing gum, both financial cost of cleanup and social cost of messy public spaces, was not worth the benefit of letting people chew gum, so they banned it. Different societies would make different choices. Most Western democracies would never ban gum because the value placed on individual liberty is too high. But Singapore has different values, and their law reflects that. The question is not whether the law is weird. The question is whether a society has the right to make collective decisions that restrict individual behavior for the common good. And that is not an easy question to answer. But let us stay in the modern era and travel to California, where there is a law still on the books that reveals how slowly legal codes adapt to social change. In California, it is technically illegal for women to drive a motor vehicle while wearing a housecoat. A housecoat, that is like a bathrobe or a loose house dress. Comfortable clothing you wear around the house. Apparently at some point, California decided this was inappropriate attire for operating a vehicle. This law likely dates from the mid-20th century, during an era when gender roles were rigid and there were strict social expectations about women's appearance in public. The logic was probably about decency and propriety. Women were expected to be properly dressed when appearing in public, and a housecoat was considered too casual, too intimate, too much like appearing in your nightwear. But here is the thing. This law is never enforced. When was the last time you heard about a woman being pulled over for wearing a bathrobe? It does not happen. The law exists in the legal code, but it is completely dead in practice. Police officers drive past women in housecoats every single day and do nothing, because everyone understands the law is outdated and ridiculous. So why is it still there? Because removing laws from the books requires legislative action. Some legislator would need to notice this law, draft a repeal bill, get it through committee, get it voted on by the full legislature, and have it signed by the governor. That is a lot of time and political capital to spend on removing a law that is not actually causing problems because nobody enforces it. This is how legal codes become cluttered with dead laws. They accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer, because the effort required to clean them up is greater than the benefit of doing so. And so California, one of the most progressive states in America, still technically prohibits women from driving in housecoats. It is embarrassing, but it is easier to ignore it than fix it. Now, let me tell you about Connecticut, again because Connecticut keeps showing up in our story, and their very recent, very specific ban on silly string. In the town of Meriden, Connecticut, it is illegal to sell or use silly string within town limits. This is not an old law. This was passed in 2004, just 21 years ago. Silly string, for those who somehow do not know, is that spray foam that comes out of a can in colourful strings. It is used at parties, celebrations, and apparently it was causing serious problems in Meriden. The issue was the annual Apple Harvest Festival, a major community event that attracted thousands of people. During the festival, silly string was everywhere. Kids were spraying it, adults were spraying it, and by the end of the day, the entire downtown area was covered in sticky, colourful foam strings. The cleanup was a nightmare. Silly string sticks to everything: buildings, trees, cars, clothing. It is difficult to remove and can damage paint and surfaces if left on too long. The festival organisers were spending thousands of dollars on cleanup crews. Local business owners were complaining about their storefronts being covered in the stuff. Something had to be done. So Meriden banned it, not just during the festival, all year round. No silly string allowed within town limits at any time. If you're caught selling it, you can be fined. If you're caught using it during the festival, you can be ejected from the event and fined up to $99. The law is actually enforced. Police officers patrol the Apple Harvest Festival looking for silly string violators. There are signs posted throughout the festival grounds. No silly string, violators will be prosecuted, and people do get caught. Every year, a few festival goers get citations for silly string possession. Is this reasonable, or is it government overreach? On one hand, silly string was causing real problems: property damage, expensive cleanup, business complaints. The law solved those problems. On the other hand, it is silly string. It is a harmless party toy. The idea of police officers seriously enforcing a silly string ban feels absurd. But this is how modern laws get made. A specific problem arises. The solution is legislation. The legislation is narrowly tailored to the specific problem, and the result is a law that sounds ridiculous when you explain it to people from other places, but makes perfect sense if you were there dealing with the original problem. Now, speaking of specific problems leading to bizarre legislation, let us talk about Tennessee and their skunk law. In Tennessee, it is illegal to import, possess, or transport a live skunk without proper permits. The law specifies that any person who imports a skunk into Tennessee or who possesses a skunk can face legal penalties. This law exists because apparently people were keeping skunks as pets. Now you might think, who wants a skunk as a pet? But domestic skunks, with their scent glands removed, can actually be affectionate animals. They are related to weasels and have similar playful personalities. Some people find them charming, but Tennessee said no, the official reason is public health. Skunks can carry rabies, and Tennessee did not want the potential public health crisis of rabid pet skunks biting people. There were also concerns about escaped pet skunks establishing wild populations in areas where they might not be native. So Tennessee created very strict regulations. You can own a skunk, but only if you get special permits. You need documentation from a veterinarian confirming the skunk is healthy and vaccinated. You need approval from the state wildlife agency. You need to prove you have proper facilities to house the skunk safely. The bureaucracy involved is so extensive that most people just give up. The funny part is how specific the law is. It does not ban all exotic pets, just skunks specifically. You can own many other unusual animals in Tennessee with fewer restrictions, but skunks got their own dedicated law. Finally, let me tell you about South Dakota, because they had a law that was so wonderfully weird and so recently repealed that it deserves attention. Until 2018, just 7 years ago, South Dakota had a law that explicitly permitted farmers to use fireworks and explosives to scare birds away from their crops, as long as they followed certain restrictions. The law said farmers could set off fireworks to protect their fields, but they could not use explosives within 660 feet of an occupied dwelling, church, or schoolhouse without written permission from the landowner. They also needed to be careful about adjacent landowners' property. This law existed because South Dakota is agricultural country and birds eating crops is a serious economic problem. Flocks of birds can devastate a field in hours, destroying thousands of dollars worth of crops. Farmers tried scarecrows, which did not work. They tried loud noises, which worked temporarily. So they started using fireworks and small explosives to create bigger, scarier noises that would keep birds away longer. The problem was that using explosives near homes, even to scare birds, was obviously dangerous. There were incidents of explosions causing property damage, starting fires, and terrifying neighbors. So South Dakota created a law to regulate agricultural firework use. You could scare birds with explosives, but you had to follow safety rules. In 2018, the law was finally repealed by House Bill No. 1015 during the 93rd Legislative Assembly. The official reason was that modern bird control methods, ultrasonic devices, reflective tape, drone technology had made explosive bird scaring obsolete. Also, the liability concerns were too high. So South Dakota removed the law after decades of agricultural explosive use. But for years it was perfectly legal in South Dakota to set off fireworks in your field to scare birds, as long as you were not too close to buildings. That is a modern law addressing a real problem, with a solution that sounds completely insane when you explain it to someone from a city. So what do all these modern laws teach us? First, that we have not learned from history. We are still creating oddly specific laws in response to narrow problems. We are still using legislation to solve issues that might be better addressed through education, technology, or social pressure. Second, that removing bad laws is harder than creating them. The California housecoat law, along with hundreds of other outdated regulations, remains on the books because nobody wants to spend time cleaning up legal code. It is boring work that does not win elections or make headlines, so the laws accumulate, creating a cluttered legal landscape that nobody fully understands. Third, that every society has different thresholds for when government intervention is appropriate. Singapore bans gum. Tennessee regulates skunks. South Dakota permitted agricultural explosives. Each law reflects that society's specific values and priorities. What looks crazy to outsiders might make perfect sense to insiders. But here is my question for you. How many of our current laws will future generations look back on and think are completely absurd? What are we legislating right now that people in 2100 will find as ridiculous as we find Draco's death for everything code or medieval shoe length regulations? Think about it. We have laws about social media use, laws about cryptocurrency, laws about drone flight, laws about genetic testing. Some of these will age well, others will look hilariously outdated within a generation. We cannot see which is which because we are living inside our own time's assumptions and values. The lesson from all of human legal history is not that we used to be stupid and now we are smart. The lesson is that every era creates laws that make sense within that era's context and problems, but look bizarre from outside that context. We are not done making weird laws. We never will be. Because law is always trying to control human behavior, and human behavior is endlessly creative at finding new ways to be problematic, unpredictable, and occasionally hilarious. As we approach the end of our journey through history's funniest laws, I want to leave you with one final exploration. We have looked backward at ancient absurdity. We have examined modern mistakes. But what about the future? What weird laws might be created in the next 50 or 100 years? What will our descendants legislate as they face challenges we cannot even imagine yet? Our final chapter takes us forward into speculation about future legal absurdity, but also into deeper questions about human nature, governance, and why we keep making the same mistakes across millennia. Let us close this journey by looking not just at where we have been, but at where we are going and what all these strange laws reveal about who we are as humans trying to live together in an organized society. Here we are, at the end of our journey through 2,500 years of human legal absurdity. We have watched ancient Athens execute people for stealing cabbages. We have seen Rome control clothing by colour and facial hair by law. We have witnessed medieval Europe throw accused people into rivers to determine guilt. We have laughed at laws about moose in airplanes and ice cream in back pockets, and we have confronted the uncomfortable reality that modern society is still creating laws just as bizarre as anything our ancestors dreamed up. But now, I want to ask you to do something harder than looking backward. I want you to look forward. What will the year 2100 think of us? What laws are we creating right now that will make our great-great-grandchildren shake their heads in disbelief? Let me start with something that is happening right now, in real time across the world. Governments are creating laws about social media use, content moderation, and online behaviour. Some countries have laws requiring social media platforms to remove certain content within 24 hours or face massive fines. Others are passing legislation about the right to disconnect from work emails. Still others are creating digital IDs and tracking systems for internet usage. Now, from inside our current moment, these laws might seem reasonable or necessary. We are dealing with misinformation, cyberbullying, online harassment, and work-life balance in the digital age. These are real problems requiring real solutions. But imagine explaining these laws to someone from 1950. You see, there is this global network where people share thoughts instantly, and we had to create laws about how long companies have to remove bad thoughts, and also laws about when you're allowed to ignore messages from your boss. They would have no frame of reference. The entire concept would sound insane, and I guarantee you that in 75 years, people will look back at our social media laws and think we were equally confused and misguided. Not because the problems were not real, but because our solutions were shaped by our limited understanding of technology we barely comprehend ourselves. Think about artificial intelligence. Right now, governments are scrambling to create laws about AI development, AI safety and AI rights, if such a thing will exist. The European Union has passed the AI Act, regulating high-risk AI systems. Some jurisdictions are debating whether AI-generated content needs to be labelled. Others are asking whether AI can own intellectual property, whether it can be held legally responsible for its actions, whether it can testify in court. These debates are happening right now, and the laws being created will almost certainly look ridiculous in retrospect. Not because lawmakers are stupid, but because they are trying to regulate something that is evolving faster than law can adapt. It is like ancient Rome trying to create laws about the internet. The gap between the technology and our understanding of it is so vast that whatever rules we create will be outdated before they are even fully implemented. Here is what I think we will see in the next 50 to 100 years, and I want you to remember this prediction so you can check back in when you are older. I believe we will have laws about human genetic modification, not just medical treatments, but enhancement. Laws about what traits parents are allowed to select for their children. Can you make your child taller, smarter, better looking, different eye colour? Where is the line between medical intervention and designer babies? Some countries will say no genetic modification at all, creating a black market for genetic enhancement. Other countries will allow it with restrictions, leading to genetic tourism where wealthy people travel to get procedures done. Still others will embrace it fully, creating a new kind of inequality where enhanced humans and natural humans have different legal statuses. And people in 2100 will look back and say, "Can you believe they tried to ban genetic modification? How primitive." Or they will say, Can you believe they allowed genetic modification? That is when everything went wrong. Either way, our laws about genetics will be viewed as the confused first attempts of a society that did not understand what it was dealing with. I also predict laws about virtual reality and digital existence. If you spend 40 hours a week in a virtual world, do labor laws apply? If someone assaults your avatar, is that a crime? If you own virtual property that has real monetary value, can it be taxed? Can it be inherited? If your digital identity is stolen, is that identity theft or something else entirely? These questions sound absurd right now because most people do not live significant portions of their lives in virtual spaces, but that is changing rapidly. And when it does, lawmakers will create regulations that sound reasonable to them, but will look hilariously inadequate to future generations who grew up in hybrid, physical-digital existence. Climate change will create its own category of weird laws. We are already seeing the beginning of this. Some places have laws about water usage during droughts, how often you can water your lawn, whether you can wash your car, what days you can do laundry. In the future, as resources become scarcer, these laws will get more specific and more invasive. Laws about how many children you can have because of resource constraints. Laws about what you can eat based on environmental impact. Laws about where you are allowed to live as coastal areas flood and interior regions become uninhabitable. Future generations will look at these laws with the same mixture of sympathy and mockery that we direct at medieval shoe-length regulations. They will understand we were responding to real crises, but they will also see how desperate and confused our solutions were. But here is what fascinates me most as I think about future laws. The pattern never changes. Every era creates laws that seem necessary and reasonable within that era's context. Every era looks back at previous eras and laughs at their ridiculous regulations, but no era seems to learn from this pattern. We keep making the same mistakes, just with different technologies and different problems. Why? Why do humans keep creating absurd laws even when we have thousands of years of evidence showing that most laws age poorly? I think there are 3 reasons. First, lawmakers face immediate pressure to do something. When there is a problem, whether it is horse theft via ice cream, bird damage to crops, or misinformation on social media, the public demands action. Politicians need to show they are responding. So they pass laws, even if those laws are hastily conceived, overly specific, or likely to become outdated quickly. It is easier to pass a bad law than to admit that some problems do not have legal solutions. Second, we consistently overestimate our ability to predict the future and control human behavior through legislation. Every generation thinks they are smarter than previous generations, that they have figured out the right way to organize society. We look at Draco's code and think, how could they be so stupid? But we do not apply that same skepticism to our own laws. We think our regulations about AI or genetic modification or social media are well-reasoned and future-proof, but they are not. They are just as limited by our current understanding as ancient laws were by theirs. Third, and this is the most important one, law is fundamentally reactive, but society is fundamentally dynamic. Law tries to create stability, predictability, and order, but human civilization is constantly changing, evolving, adapting. New technologies emerge, new social arrangements develop, new problems arise, and law is always running to catch up, trying to impose order on chaos. The result is laws that made sense when written, but become outdated almost immediately. This is not a criticism of lawmakers. This is recognition of an impossible task. How do you create rules for a society that will not exist in its current form by the time the rules are implemented? How do you regulate behavior when you cannot predict what that behavior will look like in 10 years? You cannot. But you try anyway, because the alternative is having no rules at all, which is worse. So what is the solution? Is there a way to create laws that age well, that remain relevant and reasonable across generations? I think there are a few principles we can extract from our journey through legal history. First, general principles age better than specific regulations. The laws that have lasted, things like do not murder, do not steal, honour your contracts, are broad enough to adapt to changing circumstances. The laws that look ridiculous are the specific ones. Do not wear purple. Pickles must bounce. No ice cream in back pockets. The more specific a law is, the more likely it is to become obsolete or absurd. Second, laws should focus on harm prevention rather than behaviour control. The difference is subtle but crucial. A law against murder prevents harm. A law requiring you to be married by age 25 controls behaviour without clear harm prevention. When laws try to control behaviour for its own sake, whether it is shoe length, facial hair, or social media usage, they tend to age poorly because behaviour changes, but the underlying human need for autonomy does not. Third, we need mechanisms to regularly review and remove outdated laws. The fact that California still prohibits women from driving in housecoats is embarrassing. The fact that medieval laws about armour in Parliament are still on the books is ridiculous. We need legal systems that include sunset provisions, mandatory reviews, and easy processes for removing dead laws. Otherwise, we end up buried under centuries of accumulated regulatory sediment. But even with these principles, we will still create weird laws. Because humans are weird, society is weird, the problems we face are weird, and our attempts to solve those problems through legislation will inevitably produce some regulations that future generations find hilarious. And maybe that is okay. Maybe the point is not to never create weird laws. Maybe the point is to recognize that law is a conversation across time, each generation making their best attempt to create order, knowing that future generations will judge them, improve on them, and create their own weird laws in turn. When Draco created his death for everything code in 621 before Christ, he genuinely thought he was solving Athens' problems. When Roman emperors banned purple clothing, they believed they were maintaining social order. When medieval Europeans threw people in rivers, they trusted that God would reveal the truth. When Singapore banned chewing gum, they were addressing real maintenance issues. And when we create laws about AI or genetic modification or virtual reality, we believe we are making wise decisions for the future. We are all wrong in our own ways, but we are all trying. And that is worth something. As I close this journey through the funniest, strangest, most bizarre laws humans have ever created, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. First, be humble about the laws and regulations in your own time. We are not smarter than our ancestors. We have more technology and more information, but we are making the same fundamental mistakes. Our laws are just as vulnerable to future mockery as any ancient code. Second, be curious about why laws exist. Every weird law we covered tonight was created for a reason. Sometimes that reason was legitimate, sometimes it was misguided. But understanding the context helps us understand both the law and the society that created it. Do not just laugh at silly string bands or pickle bounce tests. Ask why those laws were necessary. What does that tell you about the community? Third, be compassionate toward lawmakers. They have an impossible job. They are trying to create rules for an uncertain future using imperfect information about an imperfect present. They will fail. We will all fail. But the attempt to create order from chaos, to establish justice where there was none, to protect the vulnerable and create fairness, that attempt is noble even when the execution is flawed, And finally, remember that you are part of this ongoing story. The laws being created right now in your lifetime will someday be the subject of future podcasts, videos, and articles about ridiculous historical regulations. Your society's rules about technology, environment, genetics, identity, these will all be judged by people not yet born, by standards not yet imagined. What do you want that judgment to be? What kind of legal legacy are we leaving? I cannot answer that for you, but I can tell you this. Every generation gets the laws it deserves because laws reflect our values, our fears, our priorities, and our blind spots. If we want better laws, we need to be better at understanding what laws are for, not just control, not just punishment, but creating a framework for humans to live together in something resembling fairness and peace. That is hard. It has always been hard. It will always be hard in man, but the attempt is what makes us human. And with that, we have reached the end of our journey through the funniest laws humans ever created. We have laughed. We have cringed. We have felt grateful we do not live under Draco's code or medieval trial by ordeal. But we have also recognized ourselves in these laws. Our fears, our attempts at control, our desperate desire for order in a chaotic world. Thank you for staying with me through the song night of legal absurdity. Thank you for listening to stories of purple togas and bouncing pickles, of moose in airplanes and chewing gum bands. Thank you for being curious about human history and patient with human folly. I hope you have learned something. I hope you have laughed. And I hope you look at the laws around you with new eyes, wondering what future generations will think of the rules we are creating right now. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more chapters of human weirdness to explore. This is just one night, one collection of laws from thousands of years of human civilization. There are entire legal traditions we did not even touch. Asian law codes, African customary law, indigenous legal systems from around the world. Each has its own strange regulations, its own bizarre precedents, its own reminder that humans everywhere struggle with the same challenge, how to live together without destroying each other. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep laughing at the absurdity of human attempts to control the uncontrollable. Because if we cannot laugh at ourselves, at our predecessors, at our ridiculous rules and misguided regulations, then we take ourselves too seriously. And that might be the biggest mistake of all. Until next time, sleep well, dream of a world with fewer weird laws, and remember, somewhere right now a legislature is in session creating the next generation of legal absurdity. And someday someone will tell stories about our laws with the same mixture of affection and mockery that we have brought to the laws of ancient Greece, medieval Europe, and modern Singapore. Good night, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time for another journey through the strange, fascinating, endlessly surprising story of humanity.